Okay, recording is started. Nobody missed anything. So the section has a blog, the OOW blog. The recording will be there in a few days. The section also co-sponsors a public sociology blog named Work in Progress. This event is part of 3 events that the OOW event committee has organized this year. Members of the OOW event committee are Elizabeth Pop-Berman, who I don't think is here today, and she's the chair-elect of the section. Latonia Trotter, who is here. Hi, Latonia. Tim Bartley will join us later, and myself. The next event will take place on March 3rd at the same time, 1:30 Eastern, and it will be on racism, policing, and incarceration. Racism, policing, and incarceration, organization and occupational perspectives. And the third event will take place on April 21st. And now you have on the chat the flyer for the second event. The third event will take place on April 21st, again at the same time at 1:30, and it will be on expanding the conversation about race in OOW. Before we start, I want to thank Rachel Underwood, who will manage the questions in the chat during the event, during the Q&A part. And one last thing before we begin, I would like to give the mic to Karen. Is Karen here? Karen Arbit? If you're here, say a word so you come to the first screen. Karen Arbit, are you here from the section on public sociology, sociological practice and public sociology? Karen also wanted to say a few words to introduce the section. Hi, Karen.
Hi. Hi, everybody. I'm Karen Arbite. I'm the Secretary Treasurer of the section on public sociology and sociological practice. We are so thrilled to see OOW doing this event. OOW doing this event because we know that there are lots of sociologists working in great non-academic jobs, and that especially grad students should know more about what these jobs are and what their options are. I do recommend, if you are interested in this type of work, please joining this section. We are going to have some things on presenting public work at ASA, but also we send out non-academic jobs on a monthly basis, which other sections don't do as much of, and we have special privileges to do, but also because you can contact lots of ASA members who are working out in the public and are happy to talk to you about it. So thank you so much for setting this up, Alexandra.
Thank you for participating and introducing that opportunity of the section on sociological practice. Needless to say that we will also welcome all of you that are not part of the OOW section. We welcome you, your membership in the section. Okay, let's start. For the reason why we're here, we have 4 panelists, and we will hear them first and then have time for questions. The questions will be taken. If you have questions, just write them on the chat, and Rachel will later integrate them and introduce them to the speakers. Thank you so much, dear panelists, for agreeing to come and share your experiences. I will introduce you. I will introduce each of you before your turn. I will do it briefly, as part of your talk is to introduce yourself and your career. So I will not do it instead of you. So we'll start with Leslie Hinkson. Dr. Hinkson, my friend from Princeton. I miss you. Dr. Hinkson received her PhD in sociology at Princeton and is the Vice President for National Racial Justice and Equity at the League of Conservation Voters. And I'm just giving the mic to you.
Hey, thanks, Audra, and thanks for inviting me. I am actually the Chief Officer for Racial Justice and Equity, so I'm now in the C-suite, Sandra, so very rapid rise. So yeah, where should I start? I will say, and just full disclosure, when from the very beginning of graduate school, I was unsure whether or not I wanted to be an academic. And I think part of it is I didn't go straight into graduate school from undergrad. I did Teach for America. And before that, I actually had a corporate job. And so I knew that there were different things that I could possibly do. But I said, hey, I'm just going to give it a try. I'm going to devote 6 years of my life to this new thing. And I can tell you, as someone who studies race and racism in organizations and across institutions, it was very hard not to see the racism, not just at my graduate institution, but like along the way, right, in my career. I got a postdoc. I did the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation postdoc. I got, a tenure track job at Georgetown. And so I was supposedly fully in, but I guess I wasn't fully in. And I just happened to land in a department that was not a very healthy fit for me. And so I would say probably about 3 years in, I started thinking to myself, well, what are some options? And a number of things happened. Donald Trump got nominated as the candidate for the Republican Party. Sort of incidences of hate crimes and hate speech. And I have 3 daughters. In my daughter's school started rising in Bethesda, Maryland, of all places. And folks started bringing in these diversity folks to train us on how to make our kids not be racist. And they were horrible, right? No one had any sociological knowledge, like no one had any real facts, right, about what race is, how racism works. And and apparently they were getting paid lots of money. And I thought to myself, you know what, I could probably do this and do this incredibly well. And I also harken back to, some of the publications of Dobbin and Gallup about how this stuff just doesn't work in organizations. And I was like, you know what, I know why these things don't work in organizations. So why don't I just do this job for an organization? So I applied to one job because there was only, also full disclosure, because I'm also lazy when it comes to looking for jobs. And I had absolutely no idea how to start looking for a job after being in academia. And someone just happened to forward me this job ad and said, why don't you apply to this? I think you'd be amazing. It was the only job I applied to, and I just was lucky enough to get it. And here are some of the reasons why I knew it was a great fit. Number one, progressive nonprofit organization, right? And so I was pretty sure that some of the things that I had to deal with as an assistant professor, I was not going to have to deal with in this place. Number two, mission driven, right? And and climate change is actually one of my issues. And they had this whole idea that every single thing that they were going to do was going to center racial justice and equity. And I was like, that looks really interesting. And number three, I had to have a job where I actually had autonomy and authority to get stuff done. And pretty much like after 6 months, I got promoted from VP to being in the C-suite. And so yeah, my primary job is to manage the organizational change that we're trying to achieve across the organization. So I advise the CEO, and I work with the 2 other CEOs in the organization. We're in the middle of strategic planning. So how do we plan in a way that centers this? But I also am someone who puts out fires before they get too big across the organization. And lastly, the other thing that's great about this job is, I can approach this as an organizational, ethnography, which is actually how I'm approaching it. I'm taking great notes. I just read Karen Ho's Liquidated again, where she goes to Wall Street and does this. And I'm basically, using that book as sort of a model of how I'm approaching the way in which I document everything that I do. Also thinking about turning it into a hilarious novel about the diversity, equity, and inclusion industry that may also be made into an even more hilarious movie.
Leslie, you muted yourself.
Yeah,
Okay.
I thought you were trying to talk, so.
No. No, I wasn't.
So is there anything else I should add?
Okay. Well, we thought to keep the questions for later. So if you want to add anything else now, or we can.
There are two other things that I will say, right, is that, number one, right, I think that when we go to graduate school, because we're professionalized to believe that the only successful outcome is getting a job at a Research One institution, and that anything else means failure. I think many of us just don't even start to think about what the possibilities might be. And no, it's not failure at all. It's not failure at all. But number one, you need to remove yourself from that mindset. And then the second thing is to realize that the skills that we learn in graduate school, particularly as sociologists, are relevant across many, many, many different fields. And the hardest part is thinking through, well, how do I start imagining what those different fields might be, and what those positions within them might be. I think many of us in the field know that it's really fascinating. Many big tech companies, have sociologists on staff. Some who actually are only pseudo sociologists. So having a PhD and good training, I think will translate into jobs across many industries. But thinking about your skills and thinking about your skill set as opposed to the job description, I think is the best way to start. That's basically how I actually decided to apply to this job in the first place. If I had just been looking at the job title, I just wouldn't have applied to the job at all.
Thank you, Leslie. So we will move to our second panelist, second speaker, who is Dr. Nunez, Stefan Nunez, who received his PhD in sociology from Stanford and is a lead researcher at the Jain Family Institute. Thank you again for coming.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yes, I received my PhD at Stanford 10 years ago. Wow, 2011. And unlike Dr. Hinkson, I went directly into my PhD program right after undergraduate, and I really did think that I was going to be a professor. But somewhere in the process of the dissertation and everything, which is always a very revealing and challenging, sort of harrowing experience, I think I learned more about myself and about my work style and about sort of what I needed from a career and what my family needed from a career. And I decided that, academia was probably not going to be a great fit for me. But at that time, I really didn't know what was available outside of academia. And certainly my advisors had assumed that I was going to go into academia. And like I think you'll hear, maybe it's changing and has continued to change over the last 10 years. But there is just this sort of assumption, like, well, why would you want to go outside of academia? You don't stay with us, right? So I felt on some level almost like I was disappointing folks. But I got over that pretty quickly, I think, because you need a job and you need something that works for you. In my case, I also worked with a professor, David Grusky, who suggested to me that I think about getting into the world of program evaluation. That's sort of separate from the think tank space. It's organizations that actually set up experiments or do quasi-experimental analysis to try to evaluate policies or to try to evaluate nonprofit organizations and whether their programs are effective. This is not something I had known about, but he and others hooked me up with MDRC, which is one of the big companies in that space, along with Mathematica Policy Research and Apt Associates, RAND, some of these sorts of organizations. And I actually did a version of the job market talk based off of my dissertation that I had planned to do, in academic talks with MDRC, and was hired as a research associate there to do impact evaluation. So what did that mean? Well, I'm an economic sociologist, and I've also done social network analysis. And my dissertation work was around sort of credit markets for the poor and sort of how people's sort of interpersonal networks influence their credit-seeking behaviors, and how there are racial disparities that are built into a lot of this, and different issues of fairness and so forth. So I was actually like kind of immediately put onto a project designing and leading a study of the Grameen America program. So in terms of what skills I used, well, certainly I happen to have background in that particular topic in credit markets and labor force, and that was helpful for my job since I was working in what they called the low wage workers and communities policy area. But really, I think I was hired for my ability to do, statistical analysis, my ability to do mixed method research, because I was actually able to do interviews and focus groups and to write up, interview protocols and survey instruments, and also occasionally to do social network analysis in community development, like comprehensive community development work and that kind of stuff. So those skills, the quantitative and qualitative skills, are really, became a very heavy focus of my work over time. It did mean that I had to, I guess, bulk up a bit on my statistics. I have a master's degree in economics also, so I already had a lot of what they call econometric background. And I think it wasn't that hard. I will point out that there's still a kind of a bias against sociologists in this world. They kind of assume that, like, to know what you're doing, you have to be an economist. And they even use the term economics or econometrics as a sort of a shorthand for what we're doing. But I do think that's starting to change as a sort of a younger crowd comes in, and more sociologists, political scientists, and so forth are getting involved. I would say there was a bit of a culture shock, because this kind of work is generally team-based. You're not just off doing research on your own. You're working together to design experiments and to work with, operations folks and fundraisers and the legal team and so forth. So that took some getting used to. I think another thing involved taking sort of academic language and sort of shifting it down a notch. There's a sort of a middle area. You're not writing for a general audience. You're not writing for an academic audience. You're writing for, the educated layman, the educated layperson, somebody who doesn't necessarily have an expertise in sociology, but does, or in statistical analysis, but does have sort of the basics under their belt, and can, with sufficient sort of context and explanation, can actually get there. That's sort of the target. It's a kind of a rough sort of writing area to get into, but you can kind of develop that skill, and it's necessary, I think, because ultimately the goal is to influence policy, to talk to lawmakers, to talk to major foundations and say, look, it's a nice idea, but it's not working. And, the research on all of this suggests that you'd be better off going this other approach. And here's how, right? And without them kind of their eyes glazing over. In the last a little bit more than 2 years, I made a little bit of a change. I moved over to the Jane Family Institute, which is more of a think tank. I'm still doing empirical research and sort of designing this sort of experimental analysis of cash transfer policy. But a lot of the work now is also just much more heavily on policy design. And actually, you know, reading through the drafts of legislation and saying, look, you know, there's a lot that we know about the way that you can organize, you know, and administer a policy, and here are reasons why doing it this way are in fact, you know, not a great idea. Like if you want to get money out to people, you need to examine why these administrative burdens are here, and you know what purpose they've served, and how they've sort of excluded particular groups over the years, you know, racial groups and people. You know, who are thought of as the undeserving poor. So there's a lot of sort of sociological work in there. I work a lot with labor economists and with tax economists, but those folks generally don't have the same sort of sociological grounding in these ideas about, you know, using the administrative state as a sort of a mechanism for exclusion, you know, or, you know, whether intentionally or sort of unintentionally. And I find that a lot of the work that I've done in the past on sort of organizational behavior, organizational structure, and so forth is now starting to come into play. So in terms of practical advice, I would say, you know, they need, in this space, they need people who are pure qualitative researchers. So if that's what you do, you don't feel the need to you know, go out there and start learning about, you know, minimal detectable effect size and so forth, although having a fluency in that language can be helpful in teams. If you're doing, you know, statistical analysis, I think you really want to focus not just on the theory behind, you know, your models. This is why you use fixed effects. This is why you use random effects. But really, like, okay, now you have some dirty data, and what is it actually going to do to, like, how do you actually clean that data and implement something like this in person, or excuse me, in practice? A lot of the stuff that looks elegant on paper goes out the window when you're fielding it, and you actually have to make sure that a survey gets out to, you know, 5,000 or 6,000 people, and that you actually get a decent response rate. So a lot of the issues around that, you know, survey response bias and so forth, become up a lot, those sort of practical considerations. And if that's what you're interested in working on, those are the sorts of things you'd want to bulk up on. And I think the third thing would be, again, if you're doing sort of impact analysis, that kind of statistical analysis, you really do want to get good at coding. Outside of, you know, in the nonprofit space, there's a few sort of big organizations that use SAS, but that's increasingly, you know, disappearing and being replaced by Python and R, and, you know, if there's some old school economists at the helm of a particular organization, Stata. If you know one, you can learn the others, and you really want to focus on getting up to speed on those things and staying up to date with one or more of them, and certainly focusing probably very heavily on data cleaning, because, you know, a lot of the times you're building in this space, you're building an experiment, so you have your internal validity ready to go. What you don't have is clean data, and, you know, a lot of the work is getting the data into that point. So having a fluency with that is something that is going to be very helpful, even if you yourself are not doing that, even if you're working with undergraduates or sort of master's level folks who are sort of focusing on the data management side. You need to be able to, you know, look over their code, make suggestions, understand what they're doing, and add to it if necessary. So I think I'll stop there.
This is great. Thank you. We are moving to our third panelist, Dr. Shelley Stewart, who received her PhD from the University of California in Berkeley, and is the director of the Future of Work initiative at the Aspen Institute. And she also teaches at the University of California's Washington Center. Shelley?
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining for this conversation. Hello to fellow panelists. It's great to hear your thoughts, and looking forward to the conversation shortly. So I ended up where I am. I also did Teach for America after college. and then started graduate school at Berkeley. I'd been interested in questions of inequality, especially educational inequality, and found in the classroom that what was really challenging were these big structural factors that I found it frustrating to be working on such an individual level when there were such giant structural factors at play. And so headed to graduate school thinking, you know, I'm gonna understand what's happening here, get a better understanding, work towards trying to improve at the time I was thinking educational outcomes. Ended up at Berkeley, where everyone was going to be a professor. So I thought that meant I was going to be a professor, and sort of saw myself on that track through graduate school as you follow the winding road of research interests, got increasingly focused on work and workforce questions and less on education, still looking at inequality, especially in the tech industries and oil and gas industries. So that's where my dissertation work focused. And as I sort of was wrapping up, knowing I was going to graduate soon, I had this moment where I was starting to look at the job postings and think about them. And as scary as the job market was, and as real as the prospect of not getting a job felt, I had this moment where actually getting a job was scary. And I realized, like, that's not what I want. Like, I don't want to be here. So it led this kind of like, you know, what am I doing? I knew on one level the classroom, K through 12 classroom work was very individual focused, and the academic work was sort of too abstract and theoretical at times for what I wanted to be doing. And I sort of heard of policy work, like it sounded like a middle ground between those. I didn't at the time have any idea what that actually meant, what it meant to work in policy beyond maybe being an elected official of some kind. So I went to Washington, DC and stayed with an old college friend and reached out to basically anyone who would talk to me, who did some sort of work that seemed policy oriented and would understand the sociological background in some way. So there were a couple Berkeley alums I reached out to, just emailed a couple of people at different institutes, some of the like Mathematica and MDRC were some of them, as well as, you know, Brookings, Pew, places like that I just heard of, kind of didn't know what they were doing, and just asked people, like, what is your job? Do you like it? And is it something I could do? And I had a lot of great conversations and kind of saw myself in that environment. And one of the conversations I had was with someone, I don't even really remember how we ended up connecting, but he was working at an initiative that had just started at the Aspen Institute, which is one of these DC-based think tanks. And they had just started this data project looking at data on the gig economy and platform work. And in some ways were a bit in over their heads in terms of what it meant to compare different data sources and understand why definitions matter and some of these kind of basic methodological questions. So I ended up joining that team on sort of a consultant basis as an hourly employee working specifically on that project. And that was in my last year at Berkeley. And then that grew into a position on that team managing a portfolio of research on broadly future of work oriented tasks. Although building on my dissertation, I was looking a lot at the breakdown of the employer-employee relationship and the projection of more and more risks onto individual workers in conjunction with policies that exacerbate the insecurity and really worsen a lot of the challenges that originate in the workplace. And so I started that job and learned a lot more as I went about what working at a think tank meant. I learned quickly that the idea of research was often secondary research, and often not even academic secondary research, but sort of drawing on other think tank reports and different nonprofit and institutional reports, pulling those together. And often a lot of the work that I did was connecting that to more academic work. I knew from studying, but also from my colleagues and my cohort who were starting to land great tenure track jobs and continuing their research. I knew like, oh, she's doing work that's relevant here. I can bring that into this conversation that's directly informing, say, a decision being made on Congress or legislation being introduced. So sort of saw a lot of what I was doing as bringing together the very applied policy conversations with the academic research and knowledge bases that I knew were out there. There's some component of doing my own work, building on dissertation research, sort of some small scale qualitative work, but it is less independent research in that role. And then as time went on, I was promoted, I think once, and then towards the end of last year, the Future of Work Initiative as a program was kind of at a transition point. And I stepped into the role directing that program. And with that became a part of a broader economic opportunities program within the Aspen Institute. And so my role has shifted pretty drastically in the last several months, where a lot of what I'm doing is strategic vision planning, kind of setting the agenda and goals of the team. It's a lot of fundraising, working with philanthropies and grant managers to identify kind of shared interests and get our work funded, and also management of a team. Mentorship of our more junior staff, collaborating with directors of other programs where there's overlapping interests, and things like that. So there's kind of a component of operating with one team, the Economic Opportunities Program, which organizationally is a team that I really appreciate working with, and sort of very equity focused, sort of thinking of end outcomes for workers as the guiding principle behind the work, and also how to embody those principles organizationally. But then we are within a broader institute that has a slightly different dynamic in terms of its reputation and organizational dynamics. So there's also a component of kind of navigating that and identifying where there's real opportunities, and how, when there are challenges, how to kind of work to resolve them across different teams. I think the last thing I'd touch on is kind of when I think of transferable skills from the PhD academic experience into the work that I do now. It's not as much in the research skills or methodology skills. I find those useful often, but I think I could do my job if I didn't have those. There is a component of kind of systems thinking and understanding how different pieces of a puzzle fit together in a very broad way that I do bring to my work that I think is very helpful, and is especially helpful in things like developing a mission and vision statement for an organization and thinking, strategically, how do we get there and how do we operate in our institution, partnering with state and federal government and makers to move ideas forward. I think that level of thinking has direct parallels to kind of the process of undertaking a dissertation project and connecting it to multiple fields, each with their own deep base of research and knowledge. So that kind of ability to take on really tough puzzles and both understand how they're unique and how they relate to a bunch of existing knowledge bases is something that is transferable in a way that I don't think I realized till I started started the work. And the other thing I think I draw on very regularly is both written and verbally, taking complex ideas and explaining them to all different audiences. And in many ways, it feels like teaching. And sort of the skills I developed while being a GSI at Berkeley kind of very clearly translate into explaining why one policy suggestion is stronger than another to either legislative aides or to policymakers themselves. Are relating to other teams at our institute, why some arguments are going to be stronger than others. So I think I'd leave it there, but look forward to some questions later on.
And there's so many questions accumulating in the chat. Thank you so much. This is so useful. I want to start my career again. Our last but not least, Dr. Owens, Lindsay Owens, a 2014 Stanford PhD and an interim executive director of the Groundwork Collaborative. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. So I'll keep this relatively brief because I know there are a lot of questions mounting. I'll just say a bit about how I landed in policy work in Washington, sort of what I've done there, and then a couple of notes on things that folks can do if they're interested in getting jobs in Washington and skills that you might want to bone up on. So I got to Stanford in 2008, the fall. The recession was roaring. California was one of the epicenters. I quickly became interested in studying the housing crisis and also some of the labor market implications of that recession. My dissertation was on the housing crash. And I also published a number of papers on the safety net and employment issues during that time. Throughout that work, which was mostly grounded in stratification and economic sociology, I overlapped with Steve, and we worked closely together for a number of years. I got more and more interested in the policy conversation that was happening in Washington. That partly meant that some of my research was oriented around the policy audience. I analyzed the Home Affordable Modification Program, which was the foreclosure program in the Obama administration that was so well targeted that it barely helped anyone. But I was also, starting to kind of like write op-eds and do more sort of public-facing work. I was involved in the public sociology section in addition to the OOW section, and just realized that I kind of didn't want to sit on the sidelines, and I felt like even though my research was really impactful, I kind of wanted to get my hands dirty. So I basically decided that I wanted to work for Elizabeth Warren. She was running for Senate around the time that I was graduating. Figured if I was free labor, I'd be more likely to get a job. That was true. Applied for the American Sociological Association fellowship, got it, and then pitched myself to the Warren office as free skilled labor. They bought the pitch, and about 6 weeks in, one of her senior policy advisors went over to work for Bernie Sanders. I don't know why anyone would do that, but I ultimately got that person's job. I had been there for 6 weeks. I had a very small amount of time to sort of prove myself. They asked if I wanted to stick around. I was not necessarily planning to stick around Washington. It was definitely kind of a trial run for me. I wanted to see what it was like. I also kind of wanted to keep my academic options open. I was doing some adjunct work at Georgetown in the sociology department, and I also was still like kind of plugging along on publications on nights and weekends. But once I got that full-time job with Warren, I kind of never looked back. I was a senior economic policy advisor for her for about 4 years, and then flipped over to work on the House side, where I was a deputy chief of staff and legislative director to Keith Ellison, which I loved. But then Keith decided to run for Attorney General of Minnesota. I'm not a lawyer and also didn't want to move to Minnesota. So then I took a job working in the same role, deputy chief and legislative director for the Progressive Caucus co-chair at the time, Pramila Jayapal. The other sort of two things that I've done in DC, last year I needed a little bit more family flexibility, so I did some progressive policy consulting. I can say that that's an interesting way to get your foot in the door. I obviously had a lot of connections to build on, but mostly did sort of pandemic policy, if you will. I helped write the Denmark-style jobs program that the flight attendants got. I designed some sort of broader jobs packages, some of which were enacted into law, some of which were not. And then this, most recently, I was asked to step in as the interim executive director of an organization that I helped get off the ground in 2018 called the Groundwork Collaborative. The Groundwork Collaborative is a really interesting organization dedicated to advancing a coherent progressive economic worldview to rival the sort of neoliberal status quo. If that sounds a lot like economic sociology, that's on purpose. A lot of the folks who've been involved in some of that work are deeply rooted in the economic sociology tradition. So at the Groundwork Collaborative, I work with academics, I work with folks in think tanks, I work with grassroots coalitions, folks like Moms Rising and Indivisible. I work with policymakers, both at the federal level, in the White House, in Congress, but also at the state and local level, to really help give folks the tools and build the coalitions to argue for the policies that we can afford. So we just launched a coalition called Prosper Us, which is meant to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the Great Recession and that we continue to fight not just to get back to the January 2020 economy, but also to make the investments that are long overdue, investments around climate change, investments around racial justice, investments in the care economy. So that's a kind of tour of the different jobs I've had in Washington. The last thing I'll say, I keep up with some of my more research work and writing work through fellowships. There are a lot of really interesting fellowships in Washington. So I have a Roosevelt Fellowship and I do some writing with Data for Progress. But the last thing I'll say is I use all of the skills that I learned as a sociologist all of the time. Clear writing, problem solving. I remember being in methods classes where we were trying to come up with instruments. I mean, those are hard problems to solve, right? That skill set is one I use all day long in Washington. I will say two things that I was not prepared for in the policy world. One is management. If you're pretty good, you're going to end up in management. I mean, you can decline it, but you're going to get an offer. Learning management, I think, was something that I had to learn on the job, but it's definitely something that's worth sort of thinking about. The other, and by the way, not just managing a team, but also managing up. So managing a principal like a senator or a member of Congress, or managing a funder, or managing the executive director of an organization. And then the other thing I'll say that I needed to learn in Washington that's pretty important that I don't think academia does well is being right isn't enough. You also have to have people who are with you. So building coalitions is pretty critical in Washington. It doesn't really matter how smart you are if you only have one vote in the Senate, or if there's nobody voting for you in the ballot box. And so I think that coalition work was pretty critical, and it's definitely not something that I was prepared for in academia. It's worth thinking about how to develop some of those skills before you have to develop them in real time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for very impressive postdoctorate careers. Thank you so much for sharing. We have many questions, and Rachel is going to be your voice. I will also put here on the chat the OOW blog link where the recording of this meeting will be. So Rachel, speaking the name of the masses.
Yes, so before I begin posing questions, I want to let everyone know that since we had quite a few similar questions, I have tried to condense and make some of them concise in general to pose to our panelists. So if I don't read yours verbatim, please know I'm hoping that I got to them the best I could. So first category of questions to our panelists is on the nuts and bolts questions versus what should I be doing, which I think is on all of our minds, especially as we start to look for jobs. So with a very specific question is, what type of job board should I be looking at for these positions, or where should I be looking for these positions?
So,
Anyone?
okay, so I think I thought I saw it go by my screen very quickly. Somebody mentioned APAM. So was it the Academy of Public Policy and Management. That is the big sort of conference that all of these sort of evaluation shops go to and invest heavily in. If you actually go in person, they have a big job fair where they're doing it. So that's certainly one place. You'll see some of these things on even on Indeed as well, like the sort of nonprofit message board. But I definitely think APAM is worth getting onto their job board, and post-pandemic, going to the conferences and even presenting at the conferences if it makes sense for what you're doing, since that does seem to be where they invest very heavily in. I know I had talked with MDRC years ago about also going to, say, ASA and AEA and others, but oftentimes they'll ask for many thousands of dollars for a booth, and they've done had a lot of success sort of pulling from APAM. So I think that's certainly one of the big ones.
I think I'd add that a fair number of these jobs are not necessarily posted. If you look at sort of think tank postings, you're going to see a lot of kind of entry level BA required right out of college level jobs. And you'll see more experienced management jobs and directing jobs that require management experience. And there are definitely some PhD level research jobs out there, but not a ton. And what I've found is people in that position often end up with jobs through who you know, which as like sociologists, we should know this intimately well. But that's how I ended up with my position, and have quite a few colleagues who landed jobs similarly. So any type of like internship, consulting, possibly contributing, research organizations really should pay you. Some of them may not, to contribute in some way to get your name out there, be familiar, so that as a team is putting together a funding proposal and they want to study X and you are writing your dissertation on X, that's a great opportunity to bring you on and land a job. So I'd say don't be discouraged if you do look at a lot of job postings and feel like there's nothing out there for you, because there are jobs. There's other ways to end up with jobs fairly quickly.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. Yes, Stephen, and yes, Shelley, like my job was actually posted on Indeed, but I did not see it on Indeed. Someone sent me the ad, right? And so, right. And so, it's not that there are jobs that are posted out there that you may never have thought about applying for, except someone who knows you well and knows this industry well, or knows that organization well, says, hey, you tell me that your job sucks, like, or you don't want to be an academic, like what, what I mean? Why don't you consider this job? And I can also give you some inside information about it to make you feel a little bit easier about it being a good fit, or giving you more information about whether it's a good fit. So, like hopefully all y'all have a somewhat expansive social network. You don't only know academics, right? Go back to your friends in high school and hit them up, for some advice as well. But yeah, I mean, you should be thinking about your network very expansively now, not just folks who are in academia, but thinking about your friends who are in other industries and just asking them, so what's it like where you are? And what are the jobs that you think I could use my skills towards?
And if you don't have people in your network, like look at organizations online and just email people and reach out.
Rachel?
Thank you all. So let's move into some more questions. We have roughly 7 or 8 minutes left in the Q&A portion. So the next group of questions is what will make a graduate student stand out for this type of job? And in your answers, please be considering what kind of experiences translate best to these types of positions. Internships versus typical graduate school output things like publications and or teaching experiences. And also, how might a student plan their dissertation project with this type of job in mind? And please let me know if you need me to repeat.
I mean, showcasing your statistical abilities is always fine. If that's the way you want to go, right? Because those are obviously very portable. People need it. I do think if you write a dissertation and some section of the dissertation discusses its policy relevance, that's going to be helpful, because I think often in the early days at MDRC, I would say, oh, what about X or Y or Z? And they'd say, well, that's very interesting, but it's very abstract. Like, why should politicians care about that, right? So being able to sort of tie it to what's actually going on, I think, is very helpful. Yeah, I'll stop.
I can add one thing there. I saw Shelly put it in the chat, but just double click on that. Writing for a popular audience is a great way to do it. Publishing an op-ed version of your dissertation or a piece of your research, if you've got expertise on something and there's a timely news hook, weigh in. Doing a short white paper or research and brief version of your research and partnering, with the think tank is another great way to do it. Think tanks will frequently pay for small research and briefs, and take pitches. Press is really the coin of the realm in the policy world in many ways. Politicians care a lot about being in the news. They also read the news. Funders care a lot about press and clips. So I do think that's worth doing. Two other things. One, for finding people and jobs in the space, say two things. The first is I actually think it makes sense to be pretty active on Twitter. Even if you're not necessarily actively posting, although I think that's a good thing to do, find sociology Twitter, find econ Twitter, find policy Twitter. It's also a great way to figure out kind of who the players are in this space and who's in conversation with who. All the kind of on jobs day, which is when the unemployment figures come out, all the kind of labor economics people are tweeting together. You can sort of follow them and start to figure out where they work. And that gives you a sense of kind of where the, folks who are working on labor market policy, many of folks in this, in this subgroup are probably doing that. That's a great way to find folks. The other thing I'll just say is the job market in Washington, D.C. right now is bumping. It is it's a company town, and Trump is out and Biden is in, and that means that all the folks in the think tanks just moved into the White House and into HHS and into the Department of Ed, and then those people got promoted, and then now there's all these new openings. I mean, every organization I know is hiring for senior folks right now. I'm hiring for senior folks right now. It's a rebuilding period, vacancy chain model, whatever you want to call it, but this is not a bad time to be looking for, jobs in May in DC. And it's going to take a little while for it all to shake out. I don't anticipate filling all my jobs until the summer. But particularly with folks doing remote work, it's not a bad time to be looking now.
Just a quick note on writing to the public and not in a non-jargon way. Most universities have good, many universities have good PR offices that would help you kind of rewrite your research in a more, again, jargon-free, public-friendly way.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a specific question to Dr. Nunez regarding coding. If we have time after that, I want to pose a work-life balance type question. So Dr. Nunez and anybody else, please feel free to chime in. afterwards is there were some questions regarding one, organizations needing qualitative researchers. Is it helpful to do an internship to stand out for that? And the other is, do think tanks and government employers that hire sociology PhDs care about things like GitHub portfolios and blogs and places that others might showcase their work?
On the qualitative research thing, so if you do program evaluation, you do an experiment, and you just do the experiment, at the end of the day, you have a black box, right? It did work or it didn't work, and you really have no idea why. So qualitative researchers are sort of absolutely crucial to filling in the details of what actually happened, to try to do, mediator analysis, essentially. Everybody knows that in the field, and they say it. But when it comes down to it, if it's a bare bones budget, implementation and research often gets chopped. So I think it's extremely important to do implementation analysis. That means extremely important to hire people who have qualitative analysis abilities. I think everybody knows that on some level, but I do think that in practice, there's a lot of budget strain, and when push comes to shove, those folks are often seen as sort of, the cherry on top rather than sort of absolutely necessary. And I think that there's a lot of folks right now who are trying to make that a change in the field. That's not to say that there isn't work available for qualitative researchers, but there should be more work. And I think that's definitely something people are pushing for. In terms of being able to show off your code, yeah. When I've applied to places, they've certainly asked for code samples. I think increasingly they're also very interested in data visualization. So if you're able to show not only that you can, clean and analyze data, but that you can make, awesome charts and graphs and so forth using a ggplot or whatever else, your MATLAB or whatever else you're doing, I think that could actually be very beneficial because it does show up during the interview process.
A quick follow-up, Dr. Nunez. How would you say that quote unquote fancier methods such as data mining and machine learning are more important to these jobs versus standard statistical methods?
I don't know if I can answer definitively. I do know within the last few years it got hot to be able to do machine learning and to say the word machine learning repeatedly. So, a lot of machine learning is, just regressions and, probits and so forth. So it's not all that, but with some cross validation. So it's not, but being able to say, yeah, I can do machine learning, I can do, prediction instead of inference or whatever, I think can be beneficial. In some places like MDRC and others have set up their own kind of like internal institutes on like data science to do things like, predictive modeling for triage and homeless shelters and that kind of stuff. So it certainly can't hurt, but I'm a little bit, I guess, I'm a little bit out of it given my current job. So I'm not sure if it's still hot or if it's sort of receding, and maybe others could address that.
Do others want to address the question of machine learning and fancy methods?
I would never.
I have a thought on the method. Oh.
I was going to say I would never apply to such a job, so I can't tell you. I'm a mixed methodologist, but I don't believe in the fancy stuff.
I was going to offer a methods bit that is not in response to this question, but just I've found the kind of bar for what quantitative skills are is much lower than academic sociologists are used to in a lot of think tanks. So like I did in-depth interviews and thought like, I'm not a quant person. I am a quant person in DC think tank land. So have an open mind if you see yourself as a qualitative person. As I don't remember who was saying, like DC is dominated by economists who have a certain way of talking about issues and questions. And we need to change their minds about the language they use to talk about what they're doing so that it's more accessible.
We are over time, but we put a question of 15 minutes break between the panels. So assuming the panelists can stay for a few more minutes, we can have another set of questions. If it's okay, Mr. Panelists. Rachel?
Okay, so I'd like to ask at least one question from our work-life balance pool here. Can one or two or more of the panelists tell us what a typical day for your current role might look like, and how the salaries might vary between these applied jobs versus what we know about academic jobs?
Do you mean in the before times or in COVID times?
Ooh, maybe give us a before times,
Okay.
and a little. You can roll in a little COVID.
Well, I mean, I'll start with the COVID times. Like, it's like, I mean, I have 3 kids, although one is away at college. And I have 3 kids and I'm homing at work. Like, I do not have many breaks in between the work that I do for work and the work that I do for my household, because we're all here doing this all the time. Like, I was in the middle of leading a meeting yesterday, and my 7-year-old came downstairs crying because she couldn't figure out how to do a math problem, right? Right, so that's what my typical day looks like during COVID. In the before times, my typical day would be great. I'd get to my office around 9. I would read for 2 hours, right? And then I'd launch into meetings, right? Basically, until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And then I would write, and then I would go home. That's what life was like before COVID. So not much flexibility in terms of, you know what I mean? It's like I need to be around between this time, or at least be accessible via phone. Not like in academia where you have so much more flexibility, but I actually get work finished. Like, I'm no longer in that sort of, right, that spiral of like, oh, like I just finished this, but then I got these 3 things and I'm always teaching and I'm doing this and I'm doing, like, there is not that. Like, my day actually ends, or it used to in the before times. And one day it'll no longer be COVID. And I actually think it'll go back to that. So that's what my typical day would look like. I also should give a caveat. I'm a senior level executive, so I get paid significantly more than I did as an academic. But I would say that the people who were like even when I was a VP, I got paid more than I got paid as an academic. So
So at MDRC, when I worked there, and the same thing is true at the Jane Family Institute, one of the things I absolutely love about it is that I have a 9-to-5 job, and I have clearly delineated work time and home time, so that on nights and weekends they know not to bother me, and that's it. So that's very helpful for me, because I don't, without that, like in academia, I'd always be sort of vaguely working, but not actually working well. So I'd never get anything accomplished, but always be sort of miserable working. I don't know if that's necessarily the true if you work for like a small sort of mission-driven think tank. You might have to put in really, really long hours if that's what you want to do. I will say that the think tank space, the evaluation space, has a sort of a yearly flux to it. There's a period of time, like in, say, August, September, where federal RFPs come out, and there's sort of a mad dash to respond to these things and to grant write and to sort of make proposals and that kind of stuff. And during that time period, then you're working on, or at least I am working on nights and weekends for a sustained but temporary period of time to make sure that all this stuff gets in. It's just that the rest of the year is pretty sort of level in a way that I enjoy it.
Yeah, I think overall, I found there's there's a clear separation between work time and personal time, except in COVID, everything is thrown out the window and we're all working all the time and it's horrible. But there is more separation. It was also an adjustment for me to get used to, I think a couple others have spoken to this, a really collaborative environment. Like there's a lot of meetings, especially like as at a more director level, like 4 different people have access to my calendar and put meetings on it for me. And so I open my computer in the morning and like, oh, I have a day full of meetings, which is, you know, that's an adjustment. I don't feel like I have that control over that time that maybe I would in an academic setting, but that time ends realistically at like 6 or 7 p.m., like 5 is a goal. But that's how I'd summarize the difference. And I found that the salary overall is more than an academic salary, less than you're going to find in the private sector for-profit world. But it's likely that starting out, it'll seem low or be similar to an academic job. And people told me this, and I was like, no, I'm just going to end up making this amount. It was like $75K forever, and it's okay. I should be glad, but like it does go up, and it goes up pretty quickly for people with, you know, the educational background that a PhD would have.
Lindsay, would you like to add? Or
I mean, there's not really any work-life balance on the Hill, or like in sort of administration jobs, or, you know, if you want to do policy advising for campaigns, which I've done too, that's also terrible from a work-life balance standpoint. I agree with what everyone said about the nonprofit sector. I think that is a lot, that tends to be a lot better from a work-life balance perspective. Salaries, I don't know if I really know what academics are making these days. I think, you know, there's a range. I only took some low salaries initially on the Hill, but like agreed that it was pretty moving into a higher salary was pretty easy and happened pretty quickly. You know, committee staff on the Hill make a lot more than personal office staff. So if you're working for the Ways and Means Committee as the expert on, you know, safety net programs, like, you know, you can do quite well. If you're the expert on safety net programs in a, you know, in a House office, you're not going to do that well. But, you know, if you're the deputy chief, you'll do pretty well. I'm trying to think. I mean, the interesting thing that's kind of going on in the nonprofit space is everyone's unionizing, and as a result, the kind of entry-level salaries have gone up because of kind of a push around wage floors. But I think there's been a little bit of compression as well. So the sort of executive positions in the nonprofit space, I think you do quite well, but I do think there's a little bit more compression between like 50 and 100 in the kind of like middle management at some of the nonprofits.
thank you so much. Our time is over. We actually have 4 minutes before our next panel. Thank you so much, Stefan, Leslie, Lindsay, and Shelley. I truly appreciate, especially after hearing or thinking about the work-life balance in COVID times, you giving the time for us for this panel, very much appreciated, extremely useful and interesting. So we can do some round of reactions, applause, and everybody obviously, and the panelists as well, very welcome to stay to our next panel. Here I'll share the screen. It will start in just a few minutes. OOW and research institutes and non-faculty academic jobs. And then we'll have another one on industry and venture capital.
Can I ask a question before I jump, Sandra?
Sure.
Other than when are you going to call me? But no, my answer, my question is there a way for, if there are questions that people really do want to get like more actually answered by any of us, is there a way for you to maybe, I don't know, link us up with the questions for follow-up?
So many good questions in the chat that I just like, I'm gonna have to drop before I can respond to them.
Yeah, well, we can, I think we can, we eventually have an access to the log of the chat, and we can sort through and then send you questions. That would be very nice of you to follow up. That's a great option. Thank you.
If it could be shared somewhere publicly, just because I think individual questions could get a lot of work, but some, maybe with the posted video, some compiled responses.
Yeah, okay, so we'll think about the way to do it. Well, the first step is to have the chat log, and we'll think about how to do it in an interactive way, on a drive or something. Awesome. Thank you so much for this idea.
Bye. Good luck, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Each other.
Good luck.
Bye-bye. Keep on the good work. Thank you, everybody. So we have another session coming up. Don't go. Yeah, very generous indeed. Latonia, I'm stepping down and giving you the podium, right? Yeah. But we do have one more minute. Let's see if the speakers are here for the next session. Karen is here. George is here. Chris is here. Awesome. Thank you for coming and agreeing. And I hope the flight was so good and you didn't hit too much traffic.
Yeah.
Nobody could imagine a year ago that would be a joke.
Yeah.
Okay, Latonia, I'm off. I'm muting myself.
Okay, so it looks like we have all the three speakers, panelists, right? We have George, Karen, and Chris are all here. You never met me, so I'll just introduce myself to you before I introduce myself to everybody. I'm Latanya Trotter, and I'm also on council of the OOW section. So thank you very much for agreeing to participate. So we'll just give it maybe another minute, and then we will go ahead and get started. I think I had a question for Karen. You said a few words at the beginning of the first panel. Did you also want to say another few words at the beginning of this one?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay, all right, thanks.
I'll talk a little bit about it when I talk about myself. So.
Okay, great.
Maybe that's an opportunity to put again I put again the link for the OOW section blog, where we will have the recording and whatever instructions to some more interactive link that we will figure out for additional questions if you have. Also, it's an opportunity while we're waiting to put again the link to for our second event that will be taking place on March 3rd. Rachel, do you have that link to put again? Here it is. No, it's not that.
I'll stop it, or I'll put it in right now.
Yeah. Thank you.
There's the flyer.
So that will be our second event on racism, policing, and incarceration, organization, occupation, and work perspective. And we'll have a third event on April 21st, broadening our perspectives on race.
All right, well, welcome everybody to our second panel of the day. If you joined, you probably caught the tail end of what was a really great panel of folks sharing their experience working in government policy and think tanks. And we're about to start the second panel, and we have three invited guests who are going to talk to us about their experience doing OOW related work in research institutions and in non-faculty jobs in the academy. It gives me a great pleasure to introduce our three invited panelists, and I'll just give a sort of brief introduction because each of them are going to sort of talk about sort of their journey into their sort of current career and position. And I'll just also say for folks who are joining us in the audience, we're going to take questions after each of the panelists have spoken. So please go ahead and put any questions that you have in the chat. We have a graduate student, Rachel Underwood, who has been so kind as to sort of help us sort of manage and read all of these questions. So that will happen after each panelist speaks. So first, I want to introduce Dr. George Hober. He received his PhD from the University of Arizona, and he's currently a senior program officer at the RWJ Foundation. George, would you like to go ahead and talk to us a little bit about your journey?
Sure, and thank you for having me. So I guess I'll start with what my position is like at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So for those that don't know the foundation, RWJF is the largest philanthropy in the country with a sole focus on health. And I'm a senior program officer there, and I'm in our healthy communities. We call them themes, but they're departments. And so the focus of that theme is the connection of the conditions of place to health outcomes. So that's pretty broad, but I have 3 lines of programming. And if there's a question period, if someone wants to ask what programming is, I could describe that. But I'm in charge of 3 portfolios. One is our small and mid-sized cities portfolio, and the goal of that is to look at how can we integrate economic development practices with community development practices within small and mid-sized cities, which have really kind of lost their economic way. And so that does have a connection to my training in sociology. Really I look at that portfolio of work as connecting me to neighborhood effects research, social capital research. It's all, the economic development component connects me to the urban growth machine research. So there's a lot of background knowledge that I bring to it. How it translates is very different, which I could get to. But in addition to that portfolio of projects, I have a lot of our data portfolio. So there, again, because I'm in this theme that looks at the conditions of place and the relationship to health, what we're really looking to develop there is what are the data you need to understand that connection better? And so, like I said, everything kind of has continuity across these projects where Healthy Communities looks at economic development and community development. You can imagine a lot of the data we would want to create is relevant to those fields. So, and as a national funder, really what you want to create with data are standardized measures available for the nation at micro units of analysis. So for instance, we don't have health data for the nation at micro units of analysis. That's one. The best you could get is county. So a project that I had would be something like the CDC's Places project. And that's actually a small area estimation project. So it's not, there are some researchers have some opinions about that, but similarly, you can imagine if you're familiar with Opportunity Insights, Raj Chetty's group, and the web tool that they've created, that's the type of data projects that we want to create. And then the third set of programming is we have strategies around mindset development and mindset shifts, we call them. And really what that is how do you counter harmful narratives and frame language in ways that achieve your goals? So you could see this in some of the research. I was not a part of this, but followed closely the Gates Initiative on the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty. And in there, they had a group of researchers that were really focusing on, altering the way people understood deservingness. And so that connects again to, the data stuff connects to my background just because of research methods, but then this stuff it reminds me of all the cultural sociology that, got ingrained in grad school, and it's a lot of framing work. So there's some social movements theory and background. So there is connectivity to the topics that I studied, but like I said, very different in execution of the job. So talk for a little while, how did I get this job? That's an interesting question. I think to say that it was rational decision making that got me just up a career, that's not true. It started with the academic job market. I was always kind of wishy-washy on it anyway. I did do an internship with the Urban Institute. I thought I liked the research side more than the teaching side at the time. But really, I was also a part of a dual career academic couple, and finding working that out in academia is not, at the time, it wasn't easy. I hope it changed. I have many opinions on that, but it didn't work for us. So that kind of led to this, well, what are you going to do next? And to get a job outside of academia, really what it meant was engaging in a lot of informational meetings. We picked cities where we thought we'd want to live, and also where there are clusters of jobs. So, and we totally thought we were going to end up in Washington, D.C., because that's probably where you get the largest cluster of jobs for the types of training that we have. And that was kind of a really crazy period in our life, navigating that transition, because what that meant is we'd be teaching, and then on our off time driving to DC, setting up these random meetings with folks at organizations that we thought we wanted to learn more about and just network. And that's a really uncomfortable process, because it's a normal thing, informational meetings in sectors outside of academia, but also even within like the nonprofit sector, think tanks, and not everybody understands them. So you will have informational meetings where people just stare at you, and you have to have you have to be tough and realize that for every one of those really uncomfortable bad ones, you're going to have a good one where people will understand what you're asking for, and they'll try and connect you to people that'll help you. So it's networking. And then we kind of made a mistake, and I could talk about this in Q&A, but I did end up we picked places we wanted to live in by clusters of jobs, but also just cool places we wanted to live. And New Orleans was one of them. and I ended up getting a job there, and I decided to take it strictly because of the type of work. It was directing research on economic recovery post-Katrina for a regional nonprofit. That decision to go to a regional nonprofit that was a tough one. And I would advise against it. And so you would like to be playing in the national venue of organizations. Because to get out of that, to move up to the job I'm at now, I had to basically find a way to build up a regional nonprofit to have and the work I was doing to have a national reputation, which is hugely difficult. And I could get into the details of that at a Q&A, but it does involve, you're doing informational networks in a way that you're at least employed this time and not looking for a job, but what you are looking for is opportunities to partner with folks on national projects and get you in the mix of organizations that are like foundations, large national nonprofits, think tanks, et cetera. And through that, and then also really using LinkedIn, a headhunter eventually called me. And I was so inexperienced with headhunter that like when they called and said, hey, have you seen this job at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation? I had. It seemed like it was almost written for me and all the stuff I was doing. But I was happy in New Orleans, and I said, yeah, I don't know. And also not working with a headhunter, I was like, yeah, I don't know. They actually asked you, do you know anyone who would be interested in this job? And I said, well, no, not really. Good luck. And they said, well, wait a second. We're asking you directly in a kind of very indirect way if you want if you're interested in this job. And then I was like, oh, okay. And at that time we were very happy in New Orleans. It's a fun place to live, but it was unquestionably a jump up. So I made it through the process and got the job. So let me check see how long I've been talking just to make sure there's time for others. I've actually talked for 9 minutes. There are a bunch of stuff about skills most important and skills I wish I had and advice, but I'll hold that so others can talk and we could have a Q&A.
Thank you, George. That was really, really interesting, especially hearing, the sort of non-straight line path to the position that you're at. Next, I want to introduce our second panelist. This is Dr. Karen Arbeit, and she received her PhD from the University of Minnesota, and she's currently working at RTI International. So Karen, would you like to go ahead and talk a little bit about your work and how you got there?
Sure. I'm going to contrast myself very quickly with somebody who in the last panel said they applied to one job. I applied to 75 jobs. I applied to academic jobs. I applied to non-academic jobs. I was scared to tell my committee that where I lived was more important than what I did. I will own that now, but I applied to jobs where both my partner and I could get positions. He is not an academic. But was living in the Bay Area at the time, and the Bay Area was totally my top choice. And I actually had, I was casting a very wide net. I went to the Sociology of Education Association conference the year I was on the market, and Alexandria Walton Radford stands up right before her talk and goes, I work at RTI International. We have offices in Portland, Berkeley, DC. We're not just in North Carolina. Chicago. We're not just in North Carolina. And I went and I talked to her and I was like, you hire people in Berkeley? And we had a whole conversation and she convinced me to apply for the job, and that's the job I eventually got. So it's also like, don't assume that you understand the geography of an organization, really dig deep in those organizations. What I didn't understand was that when I got that job, they would want me working there 2 weeks later. And so I met Alexandria in February and I was working by the second week of April in my job, and I had not defended yet. But they knew I hadn't defended. So I worked 4 days a week and I wrote my dissertations and it was very on Wednesdays and Sundays. So I never went that many days without visiting my dissertation, and in the evenings, but I was getting paid pretty well. And everybody was supportive. They knew I had a job. They were supportive, I really think, on both sides, my committee and my employer. They helped me practice my dissertation presentation. And so I was a little off on the timing, but it actually really worked out for me well. So I guess I would say there was a question earlier about timing, and it was I was off, but in the end, it only delayed me by about 6 months because everybody was motivated to get my dissertation defended and accepted, including me. I didn't dawdle, I just did it. But it varies because I do know Mathematica does do an academic job market search every year because I was in their pool that year as well. So that's about it. I love my job. I just want to stand up and say, I love what I do. I love my job. I am so happy I made this choice. I get paid for 12 months out of the year. I get 4 weeks vacation. It's very flexible, very supportive. I mean, most of my coworkers are on the East Coast, so my only complaint is that my mornings are crazy busy. And then they all go home at 2 my time, and I have the afternoon to do my work in peace. Well, pre-pandemic, I had time in the afternoon to do my work in peace, and that was really nice too. But it's super collaborative. I enjoyed that. That's one of the things I would say I love about my job is how collaborative it is. Not a huge fan of the meeting culture around the collaboration, but the fact that it's not just me by myself, and if we make mistakes as a group. And so I really like that. I would say the number one most important thing in my position skill wise is research methods. And I make a lot of tables. I work on the analysis side of fielding surveys. So the data that I'm working on now will get published in a year, and then people can do secondary research on it. And that is so much fun from where I sit. I get to see the data as it comes in. I get to play with it. I'm doing an analysis right now on a survey that's in the field, but the publication will be out in about a year, and the data will be out for you to use in about a year about how COVID is impacting higher education institutions. Those are some really fun things about my job. I'm a quantitative person, but I don't use like propensity. I have colleagues that do like propensity score matching, especially on the evaluation side, but I tend to I use regression. I don't do a lot of the fancy stuff, but data visualizations are super important. When I got my job, one of the things they pointed to two things on my resume. So I'm going to point them out to you if you're looking at this kind of job, and it's RTI, Mathematica, MDRC, APT, Westat are like kind of the and NORC are kind of the organizations that are kind of similar to each other from where I sit. Is that they liked that I had needed money one year to like do something I wanted to do, and I took a job actually administering surveys in a school. Like it was like a 2 or 3 month job part-time for APT. And the fact that I had done on the ground like fielding of surveys was seen as super valuable. And then the other one was I worked at the Minnesota Population Center processing data. And because there's data processing as well as analysis in my position, that was viewed very favorably. Things I wish I had known. I wish I had known more about formal project management. Our programs do not teach enough of that, but that will get you so far in what I do and the kinds and working on big surveys and evaluation projects. And then the other one is I wish I had taken a class or two on evaluation. Because evaluation really takes your quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods skills and shows you how they're being applied in the real world. But I think it is super important that you take that in, and also don't do anything unpaid, but take that internship, take that job, if you know, that's going to give you a little bit of practical use of your methods skills, because that'll set you above somebody who says, I took 3 years of stats and I did my dissertation, which is great. And there are ways to frame all of that, but having actually worked on like a big project, or like for census, or, you know, as an intern at Mathematica, that's going to look pretty good. What else? I do education and workforce, and especially the connection between education and the workforce, but they really like that sociologists are generalists, at least where I work. And that's just kind of something to keep in mind. And somebody asked if the quant skills at RTI or Mathematica are different from Gov. I don't know that I can necessarily say that, except to say that I have clients at Gov and they need to understand what I'm doing. And so that's one way to think about it. And again, that's going to vary by who your clients are and what you do. The work-life balance where I am it's great. Is it perfect? No, but there's definitely I had to take a day off and nobody emailed me. They all saved their emails for this morning and emailed me this morning all the stuff they needed from me. So there's a ton of respect of my off time. If I get an email on the weekend, I know it's important. And so I really appreciate that, even in pandemic times, that people are trying to be respectful of my space. And then I'll just answer everything else as Q&A, except to say that it can be a non-academic career is awesome if there are things you enjoy and you're doing those things. I totally recommend it.
Thank you. I really appreciate the enthusiasm that you all are also bringing as you sort of talk about the careers that you've chosen and how you've made them. So we're looking forward to hearing more of that enthusiasm in the Q&A. So the third panelist is Dr. Chris Borg. Chris received her PhD from Stanford University. And is currently the director of libraries at MIT. So join me in welcoming Dr. Borg, and I'll let you go ahead and talk to us a little bit about your career and how you got there.
Great, thanks so much. It's really great to be here. And it's actually really fun to go third because there's some themes that are surprisingly similar and some that are different. So like George and Karen, I'll start off by talking about sort of how I landed in a job like this with a PhD in sociology. And the truth is, I started my career in libraries as a graduate student. So that was almost 2 decades ago now. But I suspect it's what was true for me then is still true now, which is that, so I was a single parent in grad school, and at the time, and again, I assume it's the same now, the stipends for graduate students were calibrated to very, very, very frugal, single childless people. I was not any of those things, so I needed a second job while I was in grad school. So I found myself a job in the libraries, actually, at the Stanford libraries, and specifically in a unit in the Stanford libraries that provided consulting to graduate students and faculty and undergraduates who were doing using statistical software or looking for data that they could use. So it was social science data services. And I started that job, my first year of grad school. And through that part-time job, I got to know the libraries. I got to spend a lot of time helping other people on their research. And so, the first thing I want to say is if you find yourself enjoying helping other people's research as much as you do enjoy doing your own research, then maybe a job outside the tenure track would be appealing. That's what I started to learn over the course of graduate school, that I actually was getting more fulfillment out of sort of helping other people do their research and realize their projects. And then eventually, I became sort of a senior consultant in the libraries. And it wasn't just the one-on-one consulting with individuals, but I actually got to take a hand in sort of designing and thinking about how to create a data service in a library that would serve the social science community at Stanford. And that was just really fun. And for me, that was more fun than my dissertation. I mean, to be blunt, not that my dissertation wasn't fun, but there was, for me, the decision point was when I realized that I actually was finding more joy and more fulfillment in the kind of work that was broader than sort of the narrow focus that I felt driven, I felt sort of driven towards and guided towards by the faculty if I wanted a tenure track job. So, so anyway, what happened was right about the time I was finishing my dissertation, or should have been finishing my dissertation, I was sort of thinking about the job market and talking to a colleague in the libraries who said, well, there's a social science librarian job here at Stanford libraries that, has been open for a year, you should apply. And I thought about it over a weekend and again, realized, wow, everything about this job is very appealing to me. So very different again from Karen's, applied to 75 jobs. I didn't apply to any job. I applied for that one job, but I was sort of recruited for it. Took it and then spent 12 years working in the Stanford libraries in different roles, first as the social science librarian, and then as a department head, and eventually an associate university librarian. And then this role here, moving out here to MIT in 2015 and taking on the role as the director of libraries. I have to echo what some other folks have said, which is the difference between sort of the tenure track job in academia and, I'm still in academia, I work in a university, I've been in universities all along, but my job is much more of a generalist than I think a tenure track position would be. So, there are other jobs besides library jobs in academia that are not tenure track jobs that are totally appropriate and fulfilling for somebody with a PhD in sociology. You'll find folks in institutional research offices, in the vice provost for research office, in diversity offices, in large universities. The sociology skills that are important are some of the same that others have mentioned. The
Did Chris freeze for everybody else?
Yes.
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 Okay. Well, if you can hear us, Chris, you froze. So maybe it might be a good idea if you could maybe, leave and come back, and we'll make space for you when you do.
I would send an email.
What's that?
I'll email Chris to see.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So we had some really really good information from our panelists, really sort of speaking from a wide sort of set of experiences, and I think that variation is really quite useful for folks. So we're going to go ahead and switch to the Q&A portion of the event. So I'm going to ask if Rachel Underwood, who's sort of managing our chat and pulling questions together, if you have sort of a set of questions you'd like to start our panelists off with.
Excuse me. First thing is I'd like to thank our panelists for answering questions in the chat. So please know that many of your answers have been put in there as responses, although I may overlap a little bit with my questions. There was a great question as far as what are some other what not to do recommendations when searching for non-academic jobs? So the opposite of recommendations.
I mean, don't just treat it like an academic job. RTI wants to see your publications, but they don't want to see your publications first. They want to see your research experience first, right? So I think those are some good things. Like a non-academic job wants to be your first choice. Like that was that was one of the questions I was asked, is they were like, are you taking this job because you can't get an academic job or because this is what you want to do? So the not to do is, they need to feel like it's your first choice, because we all like what we do. We don't view this as a second choice.
I feel like I've made a ton of mistakes, so I could probably go on and on about on this one. Learn how to use LinkedIn. I haven't, and don't look at my profile. Like I have not done it well since I got the job I'm at. But that is a tool for. It's useful. People will find you, and it's a way for kind of carving your identity and signaling to others where you'd want to work. So those you follow, how you engage those folks. It's not quite like Twitter, but you should don't avoid that. And so are there other? Don't assume that your knowledge is worth anything. So I remember writing letters being like, oh, I'm an expert in this and this and that. Really, at an organization like mine, we don't particularly care about your dissertation or the research skills you've mastered. I don't want to push people away from my job because I still use those skills. But in writing a resume, I think the way I should say this is like, not that your knowledge isn't worth anything. It's more that learn how to write a good resume too, because it's not your CV, it's not your cover letter for an academic job. You really have to kind of sit down with the job description and think of how your experience translates into the skills that go into what they're requiring. So that seems like really common sense, but still the number of PhDs that apply to our organization that give you the standard letter that they'd give to an academic institution, it's almost an immediate turnoff. I have a bunch more, but I'll stop.
Okay, well, thank you both. It looks like we still don't have Chris back on, so we will go on to the next question. Let's see. So for all the panelists, how much teaching experience, which George, I think you answered a little bit, but we'll do some verbal answering here. How much teaching experience did you develop during your degrees, and did that affect your approach to evaluation or other parts of your current role?
I haven't answered this, so I'll just say that I had only taught one class because I wanted to make sure I understood what teaching was before I decided I wanted to or didn't want to do it. And I think for what I do, I used teaching as an example of how I can convey information to people. And right, because so much of what you do is communication. And so it was about communicating both my findings and not my findings, right, in teaching. That was kind of how I talked about my teaching experience, but also how I've used that experience.
I answered the teaching one in the chat. I think I had a lot of it. I had about, probably counting grad school, over 6 years of teaching. So, but I do think, it's really, if teaching isn't in the job you're applying for, you got to really think of what are the skills that teaching give you. And to my point about how to write a resume, how do those skills translate over into the job that you're going to perform?
Great, thank you. We just had a couple more questions pop up. In these jobs or organizations, have you seen or experienced connection to grassroots social justice organizations, including direct collaboration or producing research, etc.?
That's huge.
Oh, I don't do it, but I have colleagues who do evaluations for on the ground organizations like, I don't want to name any of them, but some of the different organizations who are using grant money and want to make sure that they're both meeting their organization's goals and their funders' goals. But I personally do not.
I think that's a huge movement right now within philanthropy, really paying attention to these budding power building groups and social justice organizations. So folks with a sociology degree right now, I mean, there are organizations like Data for Black Lives that you have skills that they could use. But also, I think a lot of these organizations fall in the media and advocacy space. So, oh gosh, go to UPenn's Annenberg Communications School and look at the kind of partner organizations that they have, and that'll give you a good segue into those media advocacy organizations. Or Ruha Benjamin's data work at Princeton. If you go to her page, she'll provide you a link. But also there, if you really want to work for one of those smaller community-based organizations, I'd be careful. It'd be hard to dig your way out of there. You almost want to find these organizations that are national with local affiliates. So Right to the City would be a good example. Really look at the structure of the organization and see if it's just, what are you, regional, local, statewide, or are you part of national network?
Chris, I see that you're back with us. We are doing the Q&A portion. So when we pose a question, if you'd like to answer, jump on in. Thank you both. Let's see. So we've had a couple of questions regarding international hiring. Can any of you speak to what it's like being a non-citizen? I think you also do are American, but correct me if I'm wrong. What it might be like being a non-citizen applying for a position like this in the US. For instance, does your organization sponsor work visas?
I don't know. Is my answer for our domestic positions, but we also have international positions, and so clearly those would be very different. They're everything about those is done separately in my organization, but I unfortunately do not know. I'm really sorry.
Yeah, sadly, I know that at MIT, and I'm pretty sure the same is true at Stanford, for non-faculty positions, they tend not sponsor visas. MIT does, Stanford didn't either. I don't know about other schools, but I suspect that it's likely similar.
Okay. George, if you didn't want to respond, I'll move on to the next question.
Oh yeah, I don't know if I could answer that one. That's more of an HR question for my organization.
Yeah, it can be tough. Thank you. Do any of you have recommendations for how to secure informal interviews, strategies for getting job referrals, or other advice for distinguishing your application in the first stage of the job application process?
At my organization, the only thing you can do first stage is have a referrer, because they are aware that networking does not help diversify our organization, and that it's been shown to advantage the advantaged. But the referral, having a referral link or saying this person referred me and knowing somebody at the organization is, and I don't even know how much that helps, but that's the only way we have. And so if you know somebody, that's the strength of weak ties, right? If you know somebody who's there, like you could email me and say, hey, I wanted to apply for this job. And I'll say, okay, well, just send me the job number, put my name down, I'll put your name down. And hopefully that means you're more likely to be seen by the recruiter in that group. But from where I sit, I don't, like, unless, even when I'm on a hiring committee, that whole front end is totally blinded to me. I can't see it.
Yeah, you'll have to do the kind of cold introduction sometimes. Just find someone in an organization that matches your interests and just ask if they could talk. Like I said earlier, it's uncomfortable. And when I was doing it, I remember one in particular where I drove 5 hours to DC, had one terrible interview, and just thought, oh my God, I wanted to actually punch the person. I really felt like, demeaned in the process. And so you're going to have those, but you have to snowball off those people too. You have to start develop a professional network, but then go the extra step. And to my point on LinkedIn, connect with those folks. Clean your LinkedIn also so your buddies aren't there. Like try and say, this is my professional representation of myself. And to the extent you could connect to them, it starts to demonstrate where you are in a field. And then that is something employers will use.
Thank you. Rachel, were there any other questions coming in from the chat?
Yes, there was a question regarding, regarding the comment earlier on sociologists being generalists. So to what extent do you all feel that sociology is enough? So being a general sociology person is enough? Or do you find yourself wishing you had more background in specific things? I heard evaluation mentioned earlier, but any other things as far as library science, education, or other specific fields?
Is my signal okay? Can you all hear me now that I have my video turned off?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll take the library science question if nobody minds. It's in most of the libraries that are in the Ivy Plus, for example, the Ivy Plus libraries generally are no longer requiring a library science degree for many of their jobs, especially jobs that are specifically supporting subject and departments where you would have like supporting a social science department. An advanced degree in a social science is preferable at many of the Ivy Plus schools, or a data librarian, for example. But it varies. There are many of the public universities do have statewide requirements for an MLS. But I think for specialized jobs in libraries and for jobs at many of the R1 privates, the library science degree is no longer required.
It's all about how you market your skills. I mean, I happen to work in an education and workforce development group, so most people come in with some education or workforce development background, but sometimes I have a colleague who's an anthropologist who worked in an alumni affairs office at a post-secondary institution, and we really consider that an education background. So I think it's all about how you sell and explain your skills and knowledge and abilities. We also have a group it's called the Survey Research Division. That's what they do, right? So there's a huge degree, there's a whole range of what they do. And again, so it's all about, pointing out your skills. But if you want to work in health, make sure that you have, or you want to work in education, make sure you have some coursework and some research in that area. What do you think, George?
Sorry, I was looking at the one question on how to calculate your consulting rate, which I was thinking never make it under $100 an hour. But I'm sorry, repeat real quick. I might not actually not even have an answer.
About like how important is it to have a substantive specialty?
Yeah, not important. I think the only one, Karen, you nailed it with evaluation. Like if you have those skills, and those aren't your traditional quant skills. You have to be familiar with RCTs and yeah, really evaluation, programmatic evaluation. That really boosts your it boosts your value. But otherwise, you don't topically, yeah, I don't think you need to be really specialized.
Thank you. Dr. Trotter, we have time for more questions. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So George, why don't we go to the question you were just calculating? In consulting work in graduate school, how did you decide on an appropriate rate?
This is a good question because I do remember thinking about doing consulting work and I had no idea. And the only reason I say never under $100 is just because where I am now, we have a bunch of consultants and you would never find a rate below 100. But it's really hard to say that's your rate if you're in a local context. Like if you're working for like a, where would you get like nonprofit consulting, for instance, and it's a local, like that rate would be way out of their league. So I'm a firm believer of no, that's not where you want to be. That's really hard work and won't pay off for your PhD. You want to be at the national level. And once you're dealing with organizations like that, you should say, here's what my salary should be. And then I'll calculate from there, given that I also have to cover healthcare for myself. You should say, I want a base salary of $225,000. And as a result, your consulting fee hourly should be, I don't know, 120. Is that, I'm doing the math in my head, but that's what I've seen in a lot of contracts that have come across my desk.
Thank you. And if I know that the question was specific to folks who were doing consulting work as graduate students, but I also wanted to open the question up to the other panelists who just maybe also want to speak to, because I think this question came up in the previous panel about, the really kind of blunt question of what pay looks like and the kind of work that you do, particularly compared to sort of academic, traditional sort of tenure track academic positions.
I would say
Well,
that
go ahead.
Go, Chris.
Go ahead, Chris.
I mean, I would say for library jobs, it varies, by type of library and region of the country. But generally speaking, I think that jobs in academic libraries are very competitive, if not better paying than, and my pay now as a director of libraries is competitive with other senior leaders at MIT. I'm quite comfortable.
Thank you. You were going to speak to this question, Karen?
Yeah, the national organizations are very sensitive to regional pay and definitely adjust their pay scales for where you live. So like do keep that in mind. But I also think they're professional organizations. I have good benefits. I get paid a 12-month salary, not a 9-month salary. And the opportunity for raises is there. So very similar to what the last panel was talking about. I mean, if you're working at a small regional nonprofit, it might be a little bit different. But I think I do as well, if not better than my colleagues, especially pre-tenure. So.
And George, I don't know if you had anything else you wanted to add.
No, I think it's the same. But I think where you will notice is if you go into a non-academic job and then you shift and you say, I want to go into executive leadership, then you're opening up a whole new pay scale that's much better than academia.
Thank you. Rachel, pulling some other things out of the chat from folks.
Sure. So what organization types or position names could translate socioeconomic research into finding and implementation of solutions?
I want to say that's like implementation research, but I would also note that at least when I look at jobs, I don't find the job titles usually very illuminating, and that you unfortunately have to get past the like organizational job title name and into the job description to see it.
I have to look at that question. Where can you repeat it?
I can drop it in the chat.
Maybe also, yeah, go ahead and drop it in the chat, but maybe also, I was a little confused by the wording of the question. I wasn't quite sure what was being asked.
Yes, it is. I understand how that could happen. So what organization types or position names would translate to socioeconomic research into finding implementation, into finding and implementation of solutions? The person also put problem solving sociology related. There's also a suggestion that sociology departments, oh, no, that's a different question.
Yeah.
The other thing I can think of is that maybe that's technical assistance in some capacities. Because it's right, it's taking what we know is research and helping people apply it. That could be one place where it shows up. But again, I don't think that would be in a job title. I think that would be in a description.
Well, ideally it would be governmental, right? But that's that would be really nice. I think that's kind of a question too, that you could find some pretty sophisticated program nonprofits like purpose-built communities. So that's a network of, oh gosh, I don't even know how many sites they have, but mixed income communities. And they do pull off of research on child development, nonprofit capacity, safety. So they're really trying to apply research into what their neighborhoods look like. The model's Eastlake in Atlanta, and there's controversy around that. But, you know, that does seem to be the type of organization that gets at the question here. What are the how do you translate the research into applications? Yeah, you'd have to be crafty in finding those program nonprofits.
Thank you.
I wanted to go ahead and intervene and ask a question that I think that maybe some of the folks who might be interested in hearing a little bit more about Chris's knowledge, if maybe not actual personal experience, and sort of how one gets into positions that are non-tenure track within higher ed, within the university setting, right? So Chris shared that, you know, for her, it was just sort of somebody recommended a job and then the career trajectory was set. But given the kinds of things that you know in being in that kind of space, I'm wondering if there's any advice you might have for folks interested in that path.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, you know, my path was both that, you know, somebody said, hey, here's this job, you'd be great for it, you ought to apply. But that came about because I had a job in the libraries as a graduate student. So, you know, to the extent that there, you know, internships or other kinds of work in areas of the university that you're interested in doing some of that work even on a part-time basis while you're a graduate student can be helpful, right? Actually, if there are the university that are doing work that you think is interesting and you'd like to be a part of, talk to the faculty that are running those offices. I have a colleague at Stanford who was a couple of years behind me in the PhD program, and she ended up making a career in the Office of Faculty Diversity at Stanford because she thought it was interesting, she thought it was important, so she started making friends with the faculty there, started talking to them about their work, and so, unfortunately, Karen said it best, it's strength of weak ties and sometimes strength of strong ties. So it really is still about the networking and about putting yourself out there.
All right, thank you. I think we've got, and Sandra, correct me if I'm wrong, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left in this panel. So we're gonna go back to the chat and sort of see what are the most pressing questions. Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, so we have a few. So going in a little bit of a different direction, what should sociology departments be doing differently to facilitate PhD's employment in these settings? If you feel you can speak to that.
I'll jump in. I think it would be, I think, hopefully there's more of this going on than when I finished my PhD, but actually, when I finished and took the job in the libraries, it was actually actively discouraged to go to any kind of job that was not, that was not your typical tenure track job. Right. I hope that it's moved to at least neutral now, but I'd like it to move to celebrating the jobs that are not tenure track. Valuable, we support it, we want to encourage it. We celebrate our graduates who have attained success in other fields. I think that's really important because the pressure to, just go a certain way and go down a certain path at least was really strong years ago. I think it's probably still pretty strong.
Yeah. Karen,
I was gonna say keeping your graduates who went into non-academic careers related to the department so that grad students feel like they can contact those people and get advice or see them. But the other one is when students are looking for funding, if they want to go take a summer internship with Census, kind of encouraging it, kind of making space for somebody to take a summer to do something applied, because maybe what it teaches them is that they don't want to be applied. And I think it would be good for there to be a little more room for both of those things.
I agree with all. I can't think of anything different.
All right. Well, thank you. We probably have room for time for at least one more question. Rachel?
Yeah, so a couple of people posted that they're interested in turning their dissertations into books postgraduate school. Do any of you have experience with publishing, whether it's a book or any other type of scholarship, while doing these types of positions that are out of academia? And did you find it manageable? So do you have experience publishing while you're also working in this position?
I've published 2 articles, and I found that the support for articles is a little bit easier. That's something that my organization specifically understands a little bit better, but I think that's just very niche. I mean, there are definitely people who write books. If you want to get grants, if you want to write a book, it's good to be somebody who's also trying to get grants, I would say. And some organizations are better positioned for that than others. So I think that's just something to, you know, when you're negotiating and looking for a position, really thinking about it and being able to talk about it in that early process or like right after you get the job. I do
Yeah,
have
my
colleagues that wrote a
experience has
book and
been
it was hard for them.
My experience is similar. I've written very few articles and a handful of book chapters, but writing a whole book, I'm still trying to negotiate with the provost for a sabbatical, which is, he tells me, is unusual for a non-faculty, so that I can write a book. But we're working on it. So check back in a year and I'll let you know.
Yeah, I couldn't write a book. It's not like the time requirements have gone down that I'm outside, like they, well, when I was in the different nonprofit context, I was doing everything, managing, implementing programs, doing development for the organization, doing strategy for there was no way. But I mean, I do think you get into positions like mine where you're invited to write things that it allow you to keep a foot in academia, but not a book.
I think I'll also add that I have a friend who works in a non-academic position, but it's a think tank, right? And so I think part of it really depends upon a couple of things often. One of them is if the book actually helps further the aims and missions of the organization. And so if a think tank is doing something focused in migration studies, for example, having a nationally celebrated author who's written a book about that topic can be really helpful. But my friend had to get a position at a university, like they arranged a sabbatical with their institution, and then was able to sort of go do a one-year position at a university, which they have visiting university positions. But to the organization, that was great. They're celebrating the fact that my friend actually got this sort of visiting position, and that gives them time to do some of that writing. But I think, otherwise you're just like every other book author, you're writing on the weekends and in your spare time. I didn't mean to have the last word, although it looks like I probably did. But this has been a really, really lovely conversation. And I really, again, want to thank, Chris, Karen, and George for really giving of their time and sharing their information and experiences and advice with folks. So we really, really appreciate it. And we thank you.
Can I actually just say one quick thing related to George's last comment about soft money? I would point out that outside of academia, that there are two kinds of money. There's grant money and there's contract money. And they do operate a little bit differently. And just to be aware of that, it's not a grant or nothing. The contracts are their own ball game. And some of those positions are soft money based on contracts and some of them aren't. And you just have to find out if they're when they offer you the position or when you're talking to them, which it is.
Great.
It's very useful.
Thank you. So we are sort of ending this second panel of the larger event, but we invite folks to stick around for the third panel, which I'm not entirely sure what the theme is. Sandra, do you remember the name of the panel that's coming next?
Yes,
I don't know if we can hear you.
I think we lost Sandra. This is Tim. Industry and venture capital is the next panel, which will start at in 14 minutes. So please stay with us, stand up and stretch and move around, but please stay with us if you're interested. We'll have a whole new set of panelists and an exciting conversation.
Thank you.
We should have music or something.
Yeah, we should.
What's appropriate music?
I don't know, some kind of music. Hmm.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, yes. Can you say something again?
No, but I just fixed my mic. Yeah. I also had a joke about the music, like tech music, because it's like tech industry that we'll be coming into. Not the best joke.
Hmm.
So hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me, and we'll get started in just 3 minutes here. I just want to make sure that our panelists are arriving and have the ability to turn their videos on. I see Phaedra and Rachel and Tina and let's see. Everyone just comes up in whatever order. And Susan, I don't see yet, but I imagine she is here, and I'm just not seeing her on the screen. Let's see. So Susan, if you're here or when you arrive, go ahead and activate your camera and deactivate your cat filter. Unless you prefer to keep your cat filters on, which is also fine. And for the panelists, thanks so much for being part of this. I will give a little introduction. I think it's just slightly different than the last panel. I'll just give an introduction to everyone, just as a way of giving people a sense of who's here. And then I'll turn to you to tell us a little bit about what you do concretely and how you got into that. And I'll just go in the order that we were listed on the flyer. I'm not sure where that got set, but it starts with Susan, and then Tina, and then Rachel, and then Phaedra. And I might interject a few questions as we go, and we'll collect questions through the chat as well. And then we'll ask Rachel, who is keeping track of the chat, I think, to summarize and choose a few of the chat questions. Thanks for staying with us for the whole afternoon, Rachel. Does that sound good to the panelists? All right. And I really look forward to hearing from all of you. It's quite a group. I'm glad this has all come together. And it's been a great set of discussions so far. Let's see, Susan, are you here? I don't see her yet.
I will email Susan to double check.
We're still a minute away. I'm a just-in-time Zoomer myself. It's kind of interesting how people aren't really late on Zoom, are they? They're like, but they're not early either. The key is to like be ready to hover over and show up exactly when it starts so that you don't have the awkwardness of sitting around waiting for someone to say something or just yammering on like me. All right, so we've hit our 3 o'clock time, and let me just briefly introduce this panel and what we're up to here, and I think a few others will join us in the coming couple of minutes. So welcome everyone. I'm Tim Bartley from Washington University in St. Louis, and along with LaTanya Trotter, Sandra Kalev, and Beth Berman, we put together this, actually mostly Sandra and LaTanya and Beth helped to put together this set of panels today on careers beyond academia. And this is part of a series of events sponsored by the organization's occupations and work section that will continue next month on March 3rd with a different panel that we hope will be of interest to many of you as well on racism, policing, and incarceration, organizational and occupational perspectives. That's Wednesday, March 3rd from 1:30 to 2:45 Eastern. There's a link that we'll put in the chat with more information and a place that you can register. So I think we may have only 3 of our 4 panelists here unless Susan has arrived and I'm not seeing her. So let me introduce the 3 that we have with us, and I think hopefully Susan will be here in just a moment. So we're lucky to have 3 and hopefully 4 sociologists who have built careers in the private sector, in various parts of the private sector today. We have Tina Park, who is a Methods for Inclusion Research Fellow at the Partnership on AI, which is an AI ethics group founded by people from Microsoft and DeepMind, now part of Google or Alphabet, which as I see it involves a range of companies as well as nonprofit advocacy organizations like the ACLU and some academic scholars. Tina has a PhD in sociology from Brown, where she worked with people like Jose Itzigson and others in developing a Du Boisian frame on race and colonialism. And she's been with the Partnership on AI since mid-2020. And again, I'll just briefly introduce everyone and then turn it over to each of you to tell us more about what you do. But just to get a sense of who's here. Another panelist is Rachel Ferguson, ethnographer and head of human insights for OOW.org, which I would describe, I had to look this up and try to puzzle through exactly what it was, but I would describe as a globally focused venture capital or venture philanthropy organization. And Rachel, I'm sure, can describe this much better. Rachel has a PhD in sociology from Princeton, where she worked with Miguel Centeno and others and wrote a dissertation on extra-legal economies in the US and Europe. And she's now also doing research on creative activism in East Africa, where I believe she is based. We have Phaedra Daifa, lead behavioral scientist in the Data Discovery and Decision Science Department at Allstate Insurance. Phaedra has a PhD in sociology from the University of Chicago, where she worked with Andy Abbott, Andreas Glazer, and others, doing research on meteorologists, which culminated in her book, Masters of Uncertainty, Weather Forecasters and the Quest for Ground Truth. She's also worked at Rutgers, and she's been at Allstate, I believe, since 2018. So what I'm going to do is to ask each of the panelists, and I don't see Susan here with us yet, but hopefully Susan Biancani will join us as well, to just tell us in a few minutes what your work entails, and how you got to be doing that work. And then we'll expand into maybe lessons and things that should be on people's mind if they want to follow similar kinds of paths. So Tina, can you start us off by telling us a little bit more about what you do and how you got there?
Sure, and thank you again to all the organizers who put this together. I think this is a fantastic way to open up conversations around sort of non-academic positions. So as Tim mentioned, I'm with the Partnership on AI, which is technically a nonprofit organization actually, but because it was founded by some of the major tech companies in the Bay Area and has grown to become this major multi-stakeholder organization, it is really sort of on that edge between industry and nonprofit. So my role as a research fellow is I am the lead researcher on this project called Methods for Inclusion. And what that project involves is trying to find a suite of different public engagement practices and approaches that would enable AI developers to more ethically engage with those who are infected by the technology that they produce. So this idea that we can mitigate more harm that's produced by the technology if we can get more folks involved in the process from start to finish. And so the project really emphasizes trying to do this work as the least extractively and exploitatively as possible, while also being mindful of some of the resource constraints that companies and researchers might face. Did that hit all the questions? I think there was one more that I might have forgotten.
I mean, if you could tell us how you ended up in this position and sort of your story, and maybe draw out any implications that might have for others, that would be great.
Yeah, so I actually worked prior to going to grad school, and so I always had in the back of my mind that I may not join the academic track. And sometime probably in the middle of my dissertation process, I realized that I wanted to take what I learned out into industry, especially because I was wrapping up my dissertation right around the time that a lot more public conversation around diversity and inclusion was hitting sort of the public limelight. And it seemed like a really great opportunity to be able to extend those conversations as a sociologist who studies race. So I put out a lot of feelers and, sort of tapped into as many networks that I had, just sort of letting everyone know, look, I am very open to moving into the tech industry. My specialty is within the area of like diversity and inclusion. Send me anything that sort of piques those buzzwords and might be a good fit. And this organization was sort of launching a series of projects that ended up sort of being really perfect. They wanted somebody with a more social scientific background because they wanted it to be an interview-based study to really explore what methods would work within the industry, but also to learn from community members that are affected by the technology. And so they wanted someone who had a good understanding of how social inequality works. They wanted somebody who could do an interview-based study and could bring in research design because, this was one of the sort of first more social scientific projects that the partnership was leading on. And so it ended up being really quite a perfect fit for me and the organization as well. And it came from just a lot of having to explore what different options were out there and going to a lot of uncomfortable networking events and trying to meet more people in the industry. And basically shouting from the rooftops that I was looking for a job and send anything my way so that I could actually sift through, what different opportunities were out there. One of the things I realized was that I'd been out of the non-academic job market for about 6 years at that point, and I didn't really know what new roles had emerged during that time. Like I used to be an economic development consultant. I knew that consulting was something that I can always fall back on, but I didn't know what sort of specializations were coming through. And I was finding that, even in the tech industry, more spaces to have conversations around inclusion, but also more roles around sort of how sociologists look at inequality were forming. And I just needed to find those roles now. And so I think I was glad I took a moment just to assess what was out there before just jumping in and trying to apply to things, because I realized that job descriptions had emerged that I never thought would be something that I could be paid to do, to be honest. And it was great to see those changes happening in industry.
Thanks so much. Let me ask a quick follow-up and then also maybe redo my question a bit. So just the follow-up first is, you talked about shouting from the rooftops, putting out feelers. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that meant concretely?
Concretely, that meant accessing personal networks. And I quite honestly was fielding a lot of emails from friends who would be like, I have this friend who works in data science. Do you want to talk to them? I would sort of make it known to folks that I was particularly interested in talking to anyone who had a PhD in sociology and was working outside of the academic field. Also just to learn more from what their processes were like. And so I'm not really exaggerating when I say that I sort of shouted it from rooftops. I wasn't shy about letting folks know when I went to different networking events in the Bay Area that, I was wrapping up my PhD and I was on the market and I was looking for interesting opportunities. And it was actually a really good way to have conversations around like what kinds of roles were out there. So really looking for opportunities within industry that that allowed folks to get together to talk about sort of common interests. So I was looking at sort of tech policy things, tapping into personal networks, and being very open to having a lot of cold conversations with strangers, whether or not they actually ended up being a good fit for me or not, as well as, again, sort of tapping into other professional networks, even within sociology, to find out, who left and could I get in touch with them to find out their stories.
Thanks so much. And here's my slight redirect. I kind of short-circuited the plan a bit, because I know Sandra had sent you all some questions to consider in your remarks, and I don't want to short-circuit that. So I think I may have asked the question a bit too narrowly compared to what you were originally planning. So Tina and then others, I will simply turn the floor over to you for other remarks that you want to make in response to the questions, and then we'll have a chance to come back to some common themes too. So Tina, if there's more you'd like to say, the floor is still yours. If you've covered what you'd like to say, we can come back to you at a later point. Your call.
I would love to hear from the others. I already feel like I spoke so much.
Great, thanks so much. And I should say, Susan Biancani is now with us. Before turning it over to her, let me give a brief introduction just to add her to the list here. Susan is data science manager at Airbnb. She has a PhD in organizational studies from Stanford, where she worked with Dan McFarland, among others, studying higher education organizations and knowledge production. And she's been at Airbnb since 2015, I believe. So a relatively long history, and I imagine seen a lot of changes within that organization. So just to, I think I will turn it over to Susan to tell us a little bit more about herself.
Okay, thanks, Tim. That's correct. So I did, my area of focus, I guess, within grad school was organizational sociology, and in particular, social network analysis. And so in addition to, I was in the School of Education. I did a master's in sociology, but I also did a master's in computer science. And so did some network analysis and natural language processing there. And over the course of grad school, I gradually came to the conclusion that academia was probably not for me. As much as I loved being able to do analytical work and ask interesting questions, the biggest signal to me that it was not going to work was just the sort of timelines in general that academia involves. So my first paper had 3 authors on it, and it took 5 years to get it published. And we submitted to 3 different journals. It was between like a 6 to 8 month wait to get it either rejected or finally R&R'd. And it would, so this paper would come back 6 months later, and I'd be like, oh God, do I have to think about this again? Like I'm just done with it. And so like the emotions of that process and of having to remember what I was thinking when I wrote that introduction and all of that was not something I was excited about. And so I realized that it was probably worth trying out industry. I was aware, the grass is greener always. And so I wanted to give it a test run before really committing to that option. So I was able to get an internship at Apple. And, I heard kind of some thoughts on how to get your name out there. I would say my job search was I was just very lucky and got lucky with referrals. So I had a friend who had worked at Apple before grad school and was still working with them kind of part-time while in grad school, and connected me with a recruiter, and they tacked me onto their MBA internship program. And when they sent me the job description, I was like, I have none of these skills. Like I don't know why you're talking to me. They were like, don't worry, we didn't have time to write a new job description, just apply. So this was in the retail section of Apple. They were revising their employee survey, and they gave me all their survey data and said, what can you tell us about the experience of working in Apple stores? And so I spent the summer reading comments, going through the quantitative data, and coming up with a summary of that for them, and realized that I really liked the practicality of the work, the turnaround times, the fact that, when I came back to them with a slide deck at the end, they were, ready to implement changes. And these changes were going to actually affect the day-to-day work of like a 40,000 person workforce. So that was really inspiring to me, and also just exciting to be working on that time frame. An indication to you that maybe this wouldn't be the right take for you is like, and none of that analysis was perfect. None of it was, I didn't look at things 800 different ways and make sure that it's going to, get through a committee of peer reviewers or stand the test of time. It was really, what is the main takeaway? And then like, let's do the best we can with that and move on. So if you like that kind of 80-20 approach, then I would recommend thinking about industry roles. So after my internship, I, sort of came to the conclusion that I want to do something like this. I need to finish that dissertation. I scaled back some of my more ambitious plans. I took some stuff that was already published and I got a giant stapler, and kind of aligned with my committee, some of whom were more supportive and some of whom were maybe a bit grumpy. And so I made that decision. At that point, I had my internship. I got an offer to come back to Apple the following spring. And I had to decide within like 2 months. And so I just reached out to people I knew who were in the tech industry. I got interviews at Facebook and at Airbnb. I was specifically looking for people analytics. And so this was in 2014. At the time, really only Google had a people analytics team. I had applied through their website to be an intern there. I guess I got an interview, but didn't get an offer, and seemed like a non-starter. But through kind of talking to friends who are data scientists at different companies, I was able to get in touch with people analytics teams at their companies through them. Facebook had 3 people. They now have an organization of over 100 doing people analytics. And Airbnb didn't have anyone. So I was just talking to their director of data science there. They were going to interview me for a data science job. And I said, I'm really more interested in this people analytics thing. And they said, well, why don't you try that here? And we'll see what it is and if it's useful. So it was, really kind of taking a chance on both sides. And it's worked out. So I can speak a bit to what people analytics is and kind of the focus of the work. For me, it was really exciting because I get to use a lot of that sociology background and a lot of that study of organizations and how people work in organizations, work together, make sense of information, how different ways of organizing them might impact their ability to get things done. And so those are a lot of the questions that we work on. In addition, at Airbnb in particular, there's a real focus on diversity and belonging. A lot of companies call it diversity and inclusion. We say belonging, we kind of put belonging on that top tier because our mission is to create a world where anyone can belong anywhere. And so in addition to having hosts and guests feel that they belong when they are on, using our platform and staying at places, we also want our employees to feel they belong at Airbnb, and we want to advance the understanding of belonging in the world and in the workplace as part of that mission. So my team gets to do a lot of that work around workplace in particular. We've developed, actually just this past year, a new belonging index. We have also run our first organizational network analysis survey. So this is, asking people, who do you collaborate with? Who are your mentors? And kind of trying to identify silos in the workplace, but also identify network features that may be correlated with belonging and may be predictive of belonging. And our hope is that that will lead to interventions that we can create that might improve employees' feelings of belonging at work. In addition, we do a lot of work around diversity, both tracking current employees, making sure our various sort of centralized people processes are equitable across race and gender, surveying to understand the employee experience, and working to kind of track progress to various goals in that space. We do a lot of also what you might call real-time sensing. And so this would be maintaining dashboards showing headcount. Are we hiring in line with our headcount targets for the year? Where is attrition? Is it up or down relative to what we expect? What might be driving that? And sort of, we don't do the most basic reporting. There's a separate team that handles that, but we do anything that's a bit more analytical, looking for trends, looking for variation between groups. So the second, that was kind of, I'm answering the question, what was the focus of my work? Finding a job outside of academia, I think I mentioned, really just talking to friends. The skills that I learned in grad school that are the most important, I would say, would be, the quantitative background, certainly. Like we're using regression a lot. We use, including like limited and categorical dependent variables, comes up a lot for me. Also a little bit, some of the AI work I did related to network analysis. We're just starting up some projects using natural language processing. I have one qualitative researcher on my team. She does a fair amount of focus groups and interviews. So that's not a skill set where I'm personally very deep, but I think there's a really important space for it, and that's yielded some really important insights for us. And then, communication, writing, listening well, all of that comes into play every day. I would say the biggest skill that I wish I had practiced more in grad school, although it's not very conducive, is brevity. So learning how to just like get to the point very quickly and distill the most important takeaways. I think is really important in industry, particularly when you're meeting with executives. And in working with my team, I mean, this is something that I'm developing with them, particularly for the folks on my team who are, you know, have PhDs, are relatively recently out of grad school. They often want to answer a question with like all of the nuance it deserves. But that can potentially be confusing and also just eats up the time that you have, and it takes away from time to answer other questions. So figuring out, you know, understanding what it is that especially executives are trying to, what they need to understand in order to make a decision is its own skill. And it's not one that I particularly have practiced in grad school. And then I guess on the very practical front, so in addition to kind of having the social background, I do have a computer science background. So I'm maybe going to be a little biased in my answer here, but any programming that you can pick up will be useful. So, you know, whether that's like if you're using SPSS right now and you're working in the GUI, try and learn Stata or try and learn R. There are a lot of great sites. Like I really love Data Camp. It's interactive. It's a $25 a month subscription. The last I checked, which was a couple years ago, so maybe a different pricing model now. But you can learn statistical programming in these very short snippets, and it's very practical and hands-on. And even if you learn, let's say, Stata, and you go to work for a company that uses R, your second programming language is much easier to learn than your first. So getting that first one under your belt is absolutely worth it to whatever extent you can, even if you don't want your primary focus to be quantitative. That would be my advice.
Great, thank you so much. This is, I think we have a varied set of skills and a varied set of organizations here. So let's turn next to Rachel.
Hey, thank you so much, guys. This is a really, really cool event and super fun to be involved. I'm actually not in East Africa right now. I was supposed to be out there. I usually spend 6 months a year there, but COVID happened in March. So I stayed, I'm in the Swiss Alps, which is where I would spend 6 months a year in the Alps and 6 months a year in, mostly based in Uganda. So I'm in Switzerland now. So basically, TO.org, it is a company that was founded by two young brothers several years ago. It originally started out, they started out doing sort of impact investing, and then decided that impact carries, it's sort of a loaded term, right? And so it implies that you're investing for impact rather than investing for profit, which you can invest in really good things that have great impact and still be profitable. So, so now we don't call it impact, but we have a venture capital fund that invests in a lot of companies in Africa. We also invested in Beyond Meat. We have a bunch of other organizations that I'm not allowed to mention. And we also have a creative agency / talent agency vertical where we do branding services, we produce content, we do a lot of work for some of our portfolio companies, and we do work for ourselves in that. And then we have a philanthropic foundation. And so the foundation offers donor advisory services to specific corporate entities and people in our network. And we also fundraise within that. So in that, we operate in 2 refugee camps in Uganda and in an urban slum in Kampala. And we have a lot of operations in Senegal, mostly based in Dakar. And we're focused on 3 things. We're focused on healing the planet, essentially. So oceans, land, and people. So we have a huge mangrove reforestation project in Senegal. We have instigations in refugee camps in Uganda, where we have built recording studios, music schools. We support young entrepreneurs in refugee camps. We recently did a COVID fundraiser for the World Health Organization or with the World Health Organization and Together Fund, where we funded young refugee entrepreneurs who were making face masks and hand sanitizer to distribute in their community because they weren't getting it any other way. And we have in Kampala, we have a recording studio, a community center. A year and a half ago, we launched a Fab Lab that has 3D printers where we upcycle plastic bottles from the street, create filaments, and then the community come in and can 3D print whatever items they would like. So most of my time is, when I'm in Uganda, my time is mostly spent in Kampala, and about 25% of it in the refugee camps, which are 6 and 11 hours away from the city. And then when I'm in Stad in Switzerland, I work across all 3 verticals. At Princeton, I was an ethnographer. I rejected stats entirely. I didn't want to do mixed methods. I was very much into pure ethnography. And so using that in TO, I do everything. Ethnography is very useful in the venture capital ecosystem. When you're looking at portfolio companies and potential portfolio companies, I use it to examine our impact on the ground in refugee camps and in Kampala. And with the team, I use ethnography to basically make sure we're a well-oiled machine. I look at how everyone's interacting. I look at how our processes are working and whether we are being as effective as we can be. It's a small startup, so everyone has to pitch in, and sometimes that can wreck people's bandwidth. So I keep an eye on things like that. TO is my second job since I left Princeton. And I think this is maybe a cautionary tale for anyone who's looking at industry. The first job, I applied to a bunch of ads. I got an interview with a founder. The interview was conducted at Newark Airport in a departure lounge. And it sounded like a really exciting job. So they sent me off on a test project in Sweden. I did it. It was great. I got the offer. I moved to San Francisco to take the job. And it did not work out. And I think, the thing I really learned from that was, especially when you're looking at startups and companies without a long track record, finding out more about the founders, finding out about turnover, how many people have they cycled through in their sort of 2-3 years of existence, because that can be a really good indication. And so it's something I wish I had done at the time. It's of course difficult to do while you're on the academic job market, because you've got the emotional burden of that as well, and you're not wanting to spend hours and hours sort of doing due diligence on these founders, but it's really worthwhile. So at TO, so I left the San Francisco job after about 6 months, and TO, I came to it from a slightly, I suppose it might be an unexpected direction. One of the co-founders was my student at Princeton, and brought me on board. I had advised him on his junior work, and he had taken my class, and he knew what I did. And so they'd already sort of decided that I could contribute to their mission. I started as a consultant for them. And I think that's another thing that people need to think about. You might have to have an extended trial period, or you might want to start consulting for a company before you decide to go on full time. So I started out, I went to Uganda for 3 months. I had previously traveled to Uganda and Bangladesh with them. So I knew what they were doing in these places. And I went out alone to Uganda for a few months, hung out with some portfolio companies in East Africa, sort of over the course of about a year while I was consulting. And then we decided to sort of make it a permanent situation. As far as skills from grad school, that are important. I think honestly for me, I worked on Wall Street before I went to grad school. So I had a little bit of industry experience under my belt, but being in grad school, having the luxury of spending a few years working on my method and perfecting how I do it has certainly helped. I learned how to do ethnography in ways that are really beneficial to an organization. My dissertation work, I hung out with criminal organizations, and they're not very different than sort of lean, adaptable startup mindsets. So translating what I learned from them and how I learned to study organizations in this very sort of adaptive, dynamic atmosphere really translated into what I'm doing, whether it's hanging out in refugee camps with refugee entrepreneurs or hanging out in Switzerland with our team. It pretty much takes the same skills. So I think, from that, for anyone looking at how to get a position, it's just, you network, right? And don't ignore the fact that your students might have really cool startups under their belts that you just don't know about. And tell everyone that you're looking for stuff, because it was really when I told everyone what I was looking for, and having had a bad experience, being able to draw those lines in the sand that I was not willing to cross, and understanding what I needed and what I wanted, that made it a lot easier. I think, as far as things that people skills that candidates can brush up on or maybe think about learning, I think for me, looking at people that I interview now, it's some really basic stuff that I think we maybe don't focus on enough in grad school when people might be wanting to go into industry, because there are really high standards now in industry when interviewing, and just talking about the sort of soft stuff, the interactional stuff, having a small talk repertoire that does not involve invoking Bourdieu. Things that might fly at an academic job interview dinner are just going to leave a tech founder or any other startup founder absolutely cold, and they're not going to want to have you around them in the office. And I think, while it's great to demonstrate that sociology can shed light on pretty much anything, when a non-sociologist is interviewing you, they'll be just super turned off by hearing that as sort of within the answer to every question. Like they want to know what you bring to the table, not what you've read. So yeah, networking, don't have too many expectations of your first job outside of academia. I know, I've been listening to a lot of the folks talking tonight, and I know a lot of people who got their jobs through networks have had a great success. But if you get it from another way, if you get it from answering an ad or something like that, don't sort of feel bad if it doesn't work out when you get there. I think it's, go in with few expectations. If it's a pleasant surprise, that's great. But if it isn't, know when to decide that you've had enough and know how to leave. And you don't need to have an exit plan. I didn't have an exit plan. I just left and then figured it out from there. Be flexible. Big thing for us is, everyone leaves their ego at the door. So I'm the only PhD in the organization. I'm head of human insights. And every now and then I run out to get the CEO a coffee. Every day I am learning things from my coworkers. I have a PhD which means I have knowledge in a very specific thing, and they have knowledge in other specific things. And so I think that sort of dropping the ego is a really good way to find your feet in industry, and trust your instincts. I think this goes for looking for work, for figuring out where you fit when you find a place, and for figuring out if it's the right place for you. Your inner voice can get drowned out in the sort of anxiety of the academic job market. And you've got to keep it alive to stay focused on finding the right place for you, and then stay in touch with it once you find that place. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. And your story of how you met the founders actually resonates with one of the questions that's come up on the chat, which we'll come back to later, about how being an elite universities might shape the networks and pathways for these kinds of careers. And I think that's a really important one for us to come back to. Just for others listening, feel free to put other questions and comments in the chat, and we will come back to some of those, many of those, in a few more minutes. So thank you, Rachel, and let's turn to Phaedra next.
Thanks, Tim. And again, to echo what others have said, thank you for putting this panel together. Putting panels like this, to go back to one question that was raised in the earlier panel, what can departments do to professionalize? This is it, putting panels like this together often and socializing graduate students the opportunities and the realities and the benefits of considering alternative paths. So I'm a behavioral scientist, which is not a sociologist, but I did train in sociology. So what this means is I work for an insurance company, I work for Allstate. Everybody in the US here would be familiar with Allstate as a name, at least. What this means in practical terms, that I'm a lead behavioral scientist. Basically, I do research and I run experiments to gather insights and to optimize decisions and other behaviors. This works for me. My specialization in sociology was sociology of knowledge, sociology of orgs, and sociology of cognitive sociology, science and technology. As Tim said, I did write a book on weather forecasters. So, I did really delve for my own dissertation research. I delved into decision making. So I was very familiar with behavior science. I'm interested in complexity management and uncertainty management. So all of this is stuff that was near and dear to me. And so I do deal with those of issues day in and day out, but now as a behavior scientist. In terms of this section, although a lot of my work is about developing, making simpler, making tasks for customers simpler, making experience for customers more engaging. That is part of the behavior interventions I design. Equal parts I design interventions that are more in Susan's and Rachel's ballpark. So I work with the HR department, the people analytics department, to design interventions that improve employee retention, that improve the way employees or agents for Allstate, they're able to improve their sales performance, yada, yada, yada. So I do both. And so if that's a part, then I do apply my organizational analytics and sociological skills in improving outcomes within the organization. To the question of how I got here. So I wasn't in the first panel, so I didn't hear the background of the first panelists, but I suspect I have one of the more unorthodox trajectories here, in the sense that I did actually go down the tenure path. I was a professor, like right before the what is the expression? Something hit the fan, right? Right before 2007, right before the market, the academic job market truly collapsed. I was able to get a job, and then I didn't get tenure, right? So then I had to get to plan B. So I followed that trajectory. So you might not identify with me, that part of my story, but this might speak to people who might be adjuncting right now. And apologies for the cat, he's very vocal for some reason right now. But this might speak to people who are adjuncting and kind of feel stuck, or how long do you want to continue that? So I do want to say, that there, even at that late stage, when you feel like, that's all you're doing. And I was very much your, perhaps even today, typical, professor. Like I knew nothing outside academia. My friends were in the bubble. I was an international student to begin with. So all my friends, were inside the academia bubble. I very much drank the Kool-Aid of this is the track. And if you veer from the track, that means you failed and you veer from the track, right? So that's all I knew. I did not have a LinkedIn account. I did not know what Indeed was, nothing. This is who I was, right? That was my plan A, and there was no plan B and C and D, right? And then you're kind of, okay, what do we do now? So then I had to very quickly figure things out. I was collecting data, even for another book. So I finished collecting the data, and then really desperation hit because I had a mortgage to pay and all of that jazz. So I really had a job of applying to 10 jobs a day. I did work my networks. My mentors from Chicago, their bodies or the students, people that I knew in non-profits, in think tanks, because that is what we know. I never truly considered the corporate world because I didn't really know people there, and that's not what we hear about sociology careers. And as in the process of applying 10 jobs a day, that is my job. I'm going to apply to jobs. I came across this hiring ad. I did not put in behavior scientist, but it came up with decision making. I don't know, and it felt like it was written for me. So I applied. I knew nobody at all states. This was truly. I sent out a resume. I had worked a lot on my resume. Other people have mentioned this. Spend a lot of time, working on your resume, really distilling your skill set, really translating it from a CV, not even translating it, creating a new profile of yourself. Show it to as many people outside academia as you can. So I just did that, put my resume, which I did not personalize, but my cover letter was sort of personalized, conveying my interest in my background, decision-making, and behavior science, sent it out there along with the other 9 jobs of the day and continued on. And they called me. So there was truly a cold call, even though I was working my networks and I was doing all those things. And you should be doing that. That's where you should be investing. That is the preferred route. For me, this job happened a different route. And at the same time, I also got an interview from a think tank. And I went to Allstate for the interview. There was pre-plague days back in 2017. And I loved it, the energy, the big data. This is a brick and mortar company. I mean, insurance, like if you've asked me if I was going to be in insurance, no, I don't care about insurance. Like, even today, this is not what I love about this job. It's a big company, but it has 300 plus data scientists, like a big geeky department of other people, of which at least 10% have PhDs. Not in behavior science or sociology or even psychology, but we all nerd out. This is how I dress up, jeans and this, like I'm wearing less nice clothes than I would wear on my teaching days, right? So I was bracing myself, for the jump, like the leap. And that leap never came, no makeup, it felt like, nerding out. So it was a great environment. And then the think tank did not feel like that, right? So the appeal of the big data, all of that, it just felt I would get this job. I even moved from this job back to Chicago. I'm in Jersey right now. Obviously now I'm back here. And it's really been great. I can go more into it. I'm mindful of the time. Let me tell you some of the skill sets. So some companies will have PhDs, but even with my companies with PhDs, they do not know what to make of us, especially someone like me who really hasn't worked outside academia. I had an F1 visa, so I was not even allowed to work outside before as a grad student. I had worked at NORC, thankfully. So I did have that working for me. But so what they love, more broad skills, is you have an analytic mindset. They love that, being able to challenge the status quo, knowing how to put research together, to communicate results, hopefully in brevity. These are great skill sets that you should be able to convey and translate in your resume and in your cover letter. In terms of skills that I sort of wish I had, I mean, you can still pick them up on the job, but if you have time to do now, yes, I'm a qual person. I can talk more about that, but so from the qual perspective, additional things you can do is you can invest in some courses or some other experience to learn about user-centered design. So stuff like that a user experience researcher would do, which is a great career path from sociology, especially qualitative sociology, anthropologists. We have a lot of them in that department. In the quant field, people mentioned, yes, R, Python, data management languages like SQL, things like that. Additionally, business consulting, strategy, this is great things that you wanna invest in if you have the time. In terms of practical advice, the final thing, I mentioned working the networks. Internships are great. If you can do them, international students, it's getting better, but even right now, it's very hard to get an internship if you will need sponsorship even down the line. So that is challenging for some folks. But there are other ways, like in-house, in your university resources, where you can provide a sense that you have worked with stakeholders, like with some sense of business, that would help. And apply broadly. I would never have applied to an insurance company. I would never have applied for a behavior scientist position. So yeah, I mean, you want to be strategic initially in the way you apply, but then just, who was it Susan or Rachel who said, just apply. We haven't updated the job description. If it feels close enough, just apply for the job, and it might be the right one. Will just get you at least, a connection and a network. And just go on informational interviews with people that you might know that they know, this is the way to work in networks. Okay, I will stop here.
Thank you so much. And I think I want to take the question about the elite status of PhD programs and how that affects trajectories in the private sector here. And then I'll ask Rachel to also maybe raise a couple of questions from the chat. So keep sending those in. So maybe Tina, if we can come back to you and see if you have thoughts on, if someone were coming out of a PhD program that was not an elite program and did not have that set of contacts, what would you say would be important things for them to do to build their networks or demonstrate their competencies in a way that would pay off?
Yeah, and so one of the comments that I made in the chat is that people outside of academia don't really care or think about rankings as much and as obsessively as we do. And sort of the shorthand we use to understand, like, oh, you came from UChicago, that probably means you have a certain kind of specializations. They don't have that shorthand. And so in some ways, we have the benefit of everyone's impressed just by the fact that you have a PhD. So you do have that working in your favor. I would say the more important thing is actually to figure out, what are the concrete skill sets that I actually have and how are they practical and applicable to the role that they have open. And I think that oftentimes as graduate students and as PhDs and as academics, we don't always think about that. And so, each of the speakers talked about sort of how they translated things that they had learned or been trained in into actual practical skill sets that companies are looking for. And I definitely had to have a moment where I had to figure out what are all of those things for me and how do I represent that well on a resume? Because the other transition point too is that you don't have you're not going to be applying with your CV, you're going to be applying with a much more abbreviated resume. And you really have to highlight those skill sets and make it practical for them and walk the hiring manager through why you are actually a good fit. And in some ways, so I do think, like I noted, most of the people in my organization do come from other elite institutions. They don't happen to have PhDs, but we have hired folks with PhDs from sort of lesser known, smaller institutions. And that was because they were really effective at walking us through, like, what are you bringing to this organization? What can you contribute, especially since we're small and we're a bit of a startup. And I think having those outlined for yourself is going to take you much further than trying to bank on elite networks or institutional networks that you might have.
Do others want to speak to this question?
I would just generally agree with what Tina said. I think there are not any sort of skills or disciplinary training that you get at an elite institution that at least the folks that I work with are going to care about, that you wouldn't have just by, by virtue of your training as a sociologist. I will acknowledge, though, I think the networks are helpful. And so I would focus your energy there, being creative about, like this, reach out to us panelists, reach out to me on LinkedIn after today and say that you saw this talk. If I get general reach outs on LinkedIn, I kind of tend to ignore them. But if you put a note in there saying, gee, that talk was really interesting, then we're going to be LinkedIn friends. And then, go also try to go to smaller events if you can find them. I mentioned in the chat, I mentioned SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management. They run a bunch of sessions because there are a lot of, I guess you need continuing education credits at some places. So they run these little like 3-session courses on some topic. And you may get more interaction with a speaker or with an instructor there. And then, just find out about their jobs, find out what other resources they recommend that you get pointed to. I mentioned vendors often have events that are free. So like various platforms that are gonna magically transform all your HR data. They're really trying to get industry people to come to them so that they can sell a product to you. But because they're free and they're trying to get people excited about their product, I can't imagine them not wanting you to come. And then that can also be an opportunity to interact with people and to hear more about, well, what are the problems that your team is trying to solve? What are, the issues that are really important at your company, and trying to get a sense of where you might fit in questions like that. And then that can be a way to sort of build that network and get more in the loop with, the strength of weak ties.
I would agree with Susan and Tina. Like, guys in industry, the people who are interviewing you are really just going to care that you've got a PhD. And one of the big differences I think between industry and the academic job market is no one who's looking at your application knows if your references, like the people writing recommendation letters, are famous or not. They have never heard of the most famous sociologist. They don't care who wrote your recommendation letter. And so I think, to anyone who is coming from a non-elite university into industry, I think the best advice I can give is don't think of it as the academic job market. Don't sell yourself short, and don't assume that you are on the back foot just because you're not coming from an elite university, because I would hazard to suggest that it is a more, it's a more level playing field in industry. If you've got the skills and you've got the soft interaction skills of talking to people in a natural way, you're going to succeed. But just don't walk in with the anxiety of thinking that you won't. And then certainly in my case, the networking thing, yeah, it was an ex-student who was the founder, but you'll have student founders at every university. It's, it wasn't because he was at Princeton that he was a founder, it was because he had a really good idea. So you can find those in your campus as well.
One other thought on that, I mentioned this in the chat also. Rachel mentioned how consulting opened doors for her. I did an internship. Both of those are kind of lower stakes ways to get your foot in the door and to show that you can do practical work that actually makes a difference in an applied setting. And that is much more important than really actually even your resume, like just being able to say like, hey, I did this thing and something actually changed as a result, I think is more important than a lot of what you might have on your resume.
Great. Should we move to some other questions or more things to say about this? Rachel Underwood, would you give us a question from the chat that you think we should address?
Sure thing. So unfortunately, we're not going to have time to get to all of them. However, we are going, if I understand correctly, we are going to take a transcript from the chat and post these somewhere. So this is a question that has not come up in one of the panels today. Did the jobs that any of you applied for have a technical portion or a test in the interview, especially if it had to do with data science? And if so, do you have any advice on how to prepare for that?
I've had to do a technical aspect, and sort of like Susan, I was more oriented towards people analytics, data science jobs, and so it's not going to be the same kind of coding exercises that they make their engineers go through, but they do want to see a work sample of you dealing with data and in a short turnaround time, because the emphasis is, can you actually do this work quickly, and can you glean some interesting insights quickly with a limited data set.
So for the behavior science position, we do have a use case and there are different requirements. I am also sitting though in interviews for data scientist positions, and there they do, and all data scientists and engineers, they go through the same kind of exercises for standardization and fairness sake. And they do have a coding or programming and a use case. So they do exist and they're there. I mean, you don't necessarily need to know a specific language to do it, but you have to walk through it and you understand their logic, and they want to see how you respond and how fast you respond and how you're thinking.
And I also think for some of the roles that are more quantitatively oriented. So I know for Google, their user experience research roles that are specifically quantitative may have more robust coding exercises that they make you go through towards the tail end of the interview process, which might be different than for, say, when they're looking for qualitative researchers.
Thank you.
Oh, go ahead, Jim.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, well, let's ask one more question at least, if no one else would like to respond to that one. So there was a question about centralizing our skills as sociologists. So if you're applying for a job in people analytics, and but many of the job postings are looking for organizational psychologists. So since that.
Rachel, you're muted.
Oh,
Oh, am I? I'm sorry.
You're back. You're back now.
Okay. So how have you, in interviews, how do you recommend centralizing your skills as a sociologist when applying for jobs in people analytics if the job posting asks for organizational psychologist or a similar position or a similar title?
Oh, I ignored that. I ignored that part of the job description, and I look specifically at the roles and responsibilities and the kinds of tasks that they're looking for someone to complete. And that is actually much more important. Part of it, I think, has to do with the fact that folks don't know that sociologists have this expertise. Organizational psychology is a field that has sort of broken through into industry and sort of has, co-developed with it, and so people are familiar with it. But when I come in, like, I haven't been dinged for not being an organizational psychologist by any means, because I could speak to all the specific sort of research areas that they wanted someone to lead. And I could talk about each of those things pretty concretely, again, both in my resume and in my cover letter.
When I applied for the internship at Google, they actually sent me a form to fill out with like a whole set of different methods and asked me to rate myself from like, I have no idea to I'm an expert in this. And so that was a very IO psych focused job. And they were looking for like a specific person to do a specific thing, which wasn't me. I think you may encounter that at places with really large teams where they have, they've gotten very narrow in who's doing what. At smaller companies or companies with a smaller people analytics team or whatever team it is that you're targeting, they're going to be looking for somebody who's flexible and can work across kind of a range of skills. And depending on who hired you, if it's not an IO psych who's your hiring manager, they may have no idea. Like when I was in the CS program in grad school, they told me that I was a really interesting applicant because I was in the humanities. And to me, I'm like, sociology is not a humanity, but like that was like all the same to them because it was not technical. And so depending on the background of the people you're interviewing with, they may not have any idea about the distinction between psychology and sociology.
Thank you.
I think you have to do a fair amount of teaching others about what sociology actually is and what skill sets we have and the kinds of different frameworks we come in when we're thinking about things. Like we can do the data work for a data scientist, but our value add is really that we can put that into context. We know the social structures that affect those data points. And you have to actually walk people through it just because I think in many ways people are not familiar with what we do and where our expertise lies.
Thanks so much, everyone. I think I might be frozen. Am I frozen or can you hear me? I'm okay. Okay, thanks.
We can hear you.
Okay, so Tim, did you want to, we're at 4:01, so are we going to do any more questions or are we going to wrap up?
I think we need to wrap up. We're at 5:01 Eastern time. Yes, Tim, you're frozen. So I want to thank you, Rachel. You rock. For managing all this for a good few hours now. Thank you so much, Tina, Rachel, Phaedra, and Susan for coming and sharing this wonderful advice about which I'm sure will be very useful for everybody here. I'm putting on the chat again. I'm putting on the chat again the link to the OOW blog, where this will be the recording of this event will be posted. I hope we can also post the log of the chat. I actually went to the chat now and did Control-All and copy and paste it to a Word document. You're welcome to do that. And join the OOW section of the ASA. That's what it's all about. Thank you, Latonia. Thank you, team. Thank you, Beth, for organizing and making this happen. Great event, if I may say so myself. Thank you so much again, panelists. Tim, you're back.
I'm back, I think. Thank you all. Sorry for that. Thanks to all four of you. This is really fascinating, and I think a lot of important information and tips. And some of the things in the chat still didn't get addressed. It sounds like we have some plan for trying to address some of the questions and posting those in some form, but we'll have to talk about the best way to do that. If you, for the panelists, if you're still there, if there are things on the chat that are directed at you specifically and you'd like to respond, go ahead and then we can pull that into whatever document that we produce. Great, and for those that are still around, please join us for the next panel, which is on a very different topic, racism, policing, and incarceration, organizational and occupational perspectives. I just put a link to the flyer, which itself has a link to registration for that up. That's March 3rd.
Yeah, and another one is coming on April 21st, broadening the OOW perspectives on race. That will be forthcoming. So busy year. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
All right, we made it, huh?
Wow.
We did make it.
Should we stop the recording and maybe make a plan for how we're going to compile the questions?